And now, to start us off, let's welcome Claire Rosenzweig, President and CEO of the Better Business Bureau.
Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing? We are going to start. There's quite a few folks still making their way in. We've had an incredible turnout for this program. As the voice just said, I'm Claire Rosenzweig, President and CEO of the Better Business Bureau here in Metro New York. And the very, very first thing on my agenda is to introduce a gentleman who represents this wonderful facility, the host, in a way, of our program, Mr. David Birdsell, who is Dean of the Baruch College School of Public Affairs. David.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome, everyone. We're very pleased to be partnering on the host committee for this important event today as you discuss questions that matter a great deal not only to the nonprofit sector and to the organizations that constitute the support for that sector, but to everyone in the communities that we serve. Effectiveness is the benchmark in many respects of why we matter and how it is that we begin to think about how we matter more, do a better job with those institutions, with those organizations, and with the multiple constituencies to which we have to explain ourselves. And that explanation is important, and it starts with the kinds of questions that you're going to be looking at today. Baruch College has been proud since the establishment of the School of Public Affairs in 1994 to be closely involved with nonprofit professional development and with education in the sector. In partnership with our friends at the United Way of New York City, the Better Business Bureau, the Hispanic Federation, the Partnership for After-School Education, and other organizations, we've thought about collaborative models of professional development that are all situated now in the fulcrum that's provided by our new Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management, ably led by Jack Krauskopf, who's here today and from whom you'll hear quite a good deal later. This is terrifically important work that you do. We're very, very pleased to host this morning, and thanks very much, Claire, for that lovely introduction. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, David. Again, we are very pleased to be presenting this program and bringing it to you. It's the second time we're holding an event on this topic, and we're very, very pleased at the response that we've gotten to this program. In fact, we sold out in 2 days, and we have an extensive waiting list. So we will be doing programs to follow up on this particular program, and we'll be doing more programs like this in the future. Before we start the actual program, we have a lot of people to thank because programs like this don't just happen. We have two very wonderful supporters, the New York Community Trust and the United Way of New York City. Both of these organizations are longtime supporters of the Better Business Bureau and its Education and Research Foundation. And we really look forward to continuing this relationship with both of them. I also want to thank the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management at Baruch College School of Public Affairs. As David just said, they donated their space to us, and it's in great demand, so we really appreciate it. I also want to thank, before I go any further with the rest of our thank yous, to Melissa Popper, who's the NIPAS director of the BBB's foundation, and Luana Lewis, our Senior VP of Programs, because, again, with their help, it really pulled it all together. We have a program committee that was instrumental in helping us build the content for today's event. The New York Regional Association of Grant Makers, the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management at Baruch College School of Public Affairs, New York Community Trust, and the United Way of New York. Then there are other organizations that helped us with this event in terms of marketing and promotion, and they are the NewYorkCharities.org, the Nonprofit Coordinating Committee of New York, the Council of Community Services of New York State, the Foundation Center, the Support Center of Nonprofit Management, Women in Development, and the Association of Fundraising Professionals, the Greater New York chapter. You can find information about these organizations out at the information desk up front, and of course there are representatives here that you can talk to about what they do. I want to point out to you that in your welcome packet there's information that we hope will be good takeaways for you and very beneficial to you and to your organizations when you go back home. One item in particular that I would like to point out is a research paper that was written by Professor Greg Chen and Fred Lane here at Baruch. It's about the BBB Standards of Charity Accountability, and we've been partnering with them for the past 2 years in order to find out more information about the New York nonprofit community and its relationship with the BBB Charity Review Program. And so far, the findings have literally been remarkable, and we know that as this study continues on into the future, more conclusions will be revealed, and I'm sure we're going to be just as amazed. Also in your welcome packet, I put them somewhere, there are index cards. Write your questions on these index cards. We're going to have people picking them up. We'll bring them up to the speakers, and the speakers will answer as many as possible within the allotted time. You also have in your packet some evaluation forms. We would appreciate that you complete these evaluation forms and put them into the evaluation box out front. We would really appreciate that. Also, you know, we have breakout sessions after this general session. If you have not signed up yet, please do. These breakout sessions are in great demand. We want to make sure if you want a space, you have one. As many of you know, this event is a follow-up to our first event on charity effectiveness that was held back in April of 2006. BBB is very committed to the issue of nonprofit effectiveness. Not only is this issue the topic of 2 out of 20 standards for charity accountability upon which we base our charity evaluations, but we realize how important this issue is to the nonprofit community, to nonprofit organizations. The mission of the BBB is driven by the philosophy of accountability, and measuring organizational effectiveness is an amazing tool in order to achieve accountability, not only to the community not only to the community that the nonprofit serves, but also to individual and institutional donors. In our last symposium, information was presented on various perspectives regarding evaluation and outcomes measurement. The program worked to show that it worked to show the nonprofit community how to create and implement evaluation programs. Last year's keynote speaker, Stephanie Strom from the New York Times, and separate panels of grant-making organizations provided attendees with various perspectives on evaluation and outcomes measurement. More information about the 2006 symposium is available at the BBB's website, bbb.org, and the white paper is available in your welcome packet, your registration packet. And now, the program. Let's get started. My first order of business is to introduce Ronna Brown. If you would join me in welcoming Ronna Brown to the podium. Ronna is the president of the New York Regional Association of Grant Makers and just happens to be my predecessor at the BBB. Ronna.
Thank you, Claire. And thank the Better Business Bureau, Baruch, and all of the partners for this conference today, which looks to be absolutely amazing. We are starting off with a bang because we're starting off with Gara LaMarche as our keynote speaker. Gara joined Atlantic Philanthropies in April of 2007, and he was given the task of spending $4 billion by 2020. I know. Could you imagine? What an incredible task. Except, of course, it's a task that comes with a lot of conditions and expectations. Gara seems to be the right person for the job. Prior to joining Atlantic, he was the vice president and director of the U.S. programs at the Open Society Institute. He had previously worked at the Human Rights Watch as associate director and director of its Free Expression Project. He had a whole host of positions at the ACLU, including being the executive director of the ACLU of Texas, where he worked on adequate representation of death row inmates. Not a native New Yorker, Gara did graduate from Columbia, so he has some experience in the city. He's also on several boards. He's on the board of the PEN American Center, the White House Project, the Leadership Council of Hispanics in Philanthropy, and the Advisory Board of the Diversity and Philanthropy Project. When you think about that and you think about Gera's background, one thing is clear. He's an activist, and he is an activist with a strong vision and a commitment to openness, transparency, and demonstrating impact. He's at a foundation that has said and shown its commitment to human rights and activism. So I think all that means it's going to be a very interesting 12 years at the Atlantic Philanthropies. Gera's been quoted in several stories in the month of February, just February alone, talking about the need to ensure that Atlantic's work has an impact and that at the end, by 2020, they can show that they have made demonstrable progress towards the Foundation's goals. We now have the opportunity to hear directly from Gera LaMarche, President and CEO of the Atlantic Philanthropies, about his views on impact, evaluation, and transparency. So let's welcome Gera.
Thank you very much, Rana. I find that when you're become well known for having $4 billion to spend, a lot of development directors show up at your speeches. I have a little cart for business cards with me. No, it's a little odd that I should be standing here this morning to share some thoughts about the role of evaluations in foundations and the nonprofit organizations that they support. The fact is, I don't have much of a history as an evaluation guy. I don't remember the subject coming up in the 20 years or so I spent on the staff of human rights organizations, and for 11 years I was a senior official of the Open Society Institute, the foundation established by George Soros, who was a well-known evaluation skeptic. When last year I was named president of Atlantic Philanthropies, a foundation that is more serious about evaluation than almost any other, somehow I doubt that a rousing chorus of cheers went up in the offices of the American Evaluation Association. My approach to evaluation over the years was pretty close to that of my friend Jim Pearson, the director of the now-ended John M. Olin Foundation, a conservative philanthropy at the opposite end of the political spectrum from me, which systematically built the Federalist Society, the Law and Economics Movement, and other institutions that shaped the judicial and political landscape in the last 30 years, and not, in my view, in a good way. When I had a public conversation with Jim Pearson at OSI as part of our 10th anniversary symposium series in 2006, Jim said that Olin never did anything to evaluate the success of its grantees or thought very much about it. He could see the impact of Olin's philanthropy, he said, just by turning on the television set. Indeed. And yet here I am. You asked me to start off this symposium with thoughts on how to maximize the impact of charities and nonprofits, how to evaluate progress against mission, and how to make the most of the lessons learned along the way. And actually, I'm quite enthusiastic about addressing those questions because I've had the opportunity to learn a lot and reflect on what I've learned in my first months at Atlantic. Atlantic is one of a relatively small number of foundations. Annie E. Casey, the California Endowment, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundations, or a few others, with an in-house staff and budget devoted to what we call strategic learning and evaluation. It has the unfortunate Atlantic acronym of SLAY, which suggests a violent approach to the assessment of grantees. But in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Atlantic has what you might call a holistic approach to grant making, that whatever refinements or improvements I might bring in the coming years is very much on the right track. First, we do most of the things that critics of foundations are always saying foundations should do. We make substantial grants over a multi-year period and generally for operating support, not program limited. This gives grantees the tools to truly build their capacity, enough running room not to be constantly obsessed about fundraising, and support that is flexible enough for them to adjust to their needs as they perceive them and as they evolve. But even more interesting, Atlantic not only puts the program officer, we call them program executives with a double M-E at the end because we're Bermuda, not a U.S. foundation, and we like to be different. At the center of the decision is he or she should be. But it also adds the benefits of a team of staff from our finance, communications, SLAY, and other departments. These essential sources of expertise in reviewing budgets, assessing public education strategies, and strengthening organizational developments and assessment mechanisms are involved in key grants from the get-go, not well after the fact, is too often the case in most philanthropy. And they often work closely with grantees and applicants as well as with our own program staff. I think that this interdisciplinary approach to grant making, not just as the grant is being considered, but during the full life of the grant, is distinctive and worth studying and replicating. But of course it's a path that is only opened at that scale to fairly large foundations, not to small, lightly staffed ones, or to most individual donors. Evaluation in some form, however, is something every organization of any size has to think about and plan for. Indeed, it pervades virtually every aspect of our personal and political lives. How do you know you've succeeded in a goal? Whether it's winning a primary or caucus, reaching customers, losing weight, or teaching kids to read, we accept the fact that you don't know how you're doing if you don't have some form of measurement. Why should foundations and charities be any different? Looked at that way, not to have an understanding of evaluation from the start of a venture seems reckless, a form of organizational malpractice. Before getting more deeply into this, however, I ought to say that I'm ambivalent, as Atlantic staff knows, about the very word evaluation. The dictionary tells us that to evaluate is to, 1, determine or set the value or amount of, appraise, as in evaluate property, or 2, to judge or determine the significance, worth, or quality of, assess, as in to evaluate the results of an experiment. That's not quite the way I would want to look at evaluation, so while we all strive to come up with different and better words that don't conjure up a process like Antiques Roadshow or The Apprentice, let me try to redefine this one. For a grant maker to evaluate its grants, or to use the more fashionable word of the moment, its investments, and for a nonprofit to evaluate its own impact, either in total organization terms or in terms of a particular project or initiative, is really, most simply, to learn. That's why the first 2 letters of Atlantic's SLAY acronym stand for strategic learning. Foundations and the organizations they support should strive always to be learning centers, rooted in a clear mission, but constantly reflective about practice. Many things go into that learning of what we usually call evaluation is just one part. One's own professional judgment, informed by all the observation, experience, and data you can draw upon, is, in my view, the most significant part. An organization which at the board and staff levels provides the opportunity for regular, honest discussions about practice and impact, where a tone is set from board and senior management that rewards candor and self-examination and sees setbacks or even failure not as things to be hidden or punished, but things to be studied and built upon, is the core upon which any other kinds of evaluation must rest. I want to talk next about the different kinds of evaluation efforts that Atlantic and its grantees engage in, to unpack the umbrella term a bit and give a sense of the diverse approaches available. It's not so much a matter of choosing one as your organizational brand, as it is determining which is the right approach for which initiative at which time. Then I want to set out a little list of what I've come to think as do's and don'ts about evaluation. It's highly personal and somewhat arbitrary, but will give you a sense of what I think I've learned along the way. And finally, I want to conclude with a few bits of advice to donors, particularly families and individuals of wealth who are considering starting or expanding their own philanthropy, but unsure of how to get the most bang for their buck. It's with this audience in mind that I've begun to rethink some of my formerly breezy attitude toward evaluation. Newer, often younger donors, successful in the business world, want answers about impact. And while traditional philanthropy needs to help them understand the ways in which social initiatives are often quite different from profit-making ventures, we also need to be responsive to these quite legitimate concerns and to raise our own game. I'm indebted. Accidentally swallowed an ice cube. I'm indebted to my colleague Jackie Williams K of SLAY, who worked in an evaluation job at Edna McConnell Clark before coming to us, for walking me through her taxonomy of the different evaluation approaches that Atlantic uses. The core question for us in all cases, as I suggested a moment ago, is what is useful to learn? So a number of Atlantic's direct service grantees, such as the Experience Corps funded by our aging program, where retired teachers and civil servants tutor in math, or Citizen Schools, a terrific after-school provider supported by our Disadvantaged Youth Program, we employ a fairly comprehensive and integrated evaluation system. These kinds of programs combine an internal evaluation system focused on quality with an external evaluation focused on effectiveness. An integrated system designed for continuous improvement provides a range of analysis that lets staff look at trends as well as a number of targeted questions. For example, when participation patterns among kids enrolled in the Children's Aid Society Carrera program were tracked, Carrera learned that boys, and in particular older boys, were more challenging to engage than girls. Tell me about it. The program rethought its strategy for reaching and keeping boys involved, beginning with engaging them at earlier ages. The program also learned that the attendance of older participants dropped substantially because they needed jobs after school and on the weekends. So Carrera responded by creating paid internships and integrating outside employment into the jobs component of the program. Instead of losing these kids because they couldn't attend, the program figured out how to stay connected to them. Having good data about why kids weren't attending allowed them to do this. By tracking retention rates, Citizen Schools learned early on that they lost kids after the first semester. They explored possible reasons and discovered that starting second semester programming at the beginning of February was too late. They moved the second semester start date to soon after the holidays and implemented more intentional outreach to ensure that participants stayed engaged. Another approach that we use is to use an embedded outside evaluator, someone trusted by the grantee and the funder who stays with an initiative over a period of time and provides periodic reports on a regular basis that can affect the course of the work in real time. In 2004, Atlantic funded a 2-year campaign in 5 states to restore voting rights for those with felony convictions, and soon added a recommendation to add an evaluation and learning component provided by Wolf Keynes and Associates. A key question for the evaluation focused on the coordination among the national groups involved and the coordination between the national and state groups. States play a key role in setting policies that affect disadvantaged people and informing federal policy. Lessons from this work are of interest across Atlantic's programs in the U.S. since the learning from this project not only enhances the Right to Vote campaign, but could potentially strengthen other efforts involving state campaigns. Bill Keynes, the evaluator, worked closely with many participants in the Right to Vote campaign, attending meetings and providing regular feedback. The detailed documentation of his work overall have helped all partners understand the greater effort and learn from both mistakes and successes. For instance, Keynes found that the campaign's original design, and honesty requires me to make it clear that the design was funder-driven, ensured that the problems embedded in the structure would be hard to overcome. In the absence of a decision-making hierarchy or more adaptive culture, Keynes wrote, those involved had no real means of operational revision. Groups that may have worked shoulder to shoulder in other contexts sometimes found themselves at odds with both money and reputations at stake and no adjudicating authority to which to turn. Now, those are hard words for a funder to hear and less likely to be expressed directly by the groups involved, funded, no matter how trusting a relationship has been developed. It turns out when you entice groups into a partnership based not on their organic desire to collaborate, but on the prospect of money, it doesn't always work out so well. But both the JET Foundation, the prime mover of the Right to Vote campaign, and Atlantic, OSI, and other key backers learned from these lessons and have handled subsequent multi-organization, multi-state campaigns somewhat differently. An ongoing assessment of another Atlantic-funded human rights campaign, the vitally important one to enact comprehensive immigration reform, faulted the Comprehensive Campaign for Immigration Reform, our grantee, for, quote, missing the boat on the change in climate which happened in a relatively short period of time and had enormous impact on the policy and legislative debate. In effect, CCR was not enough attuned to the country's debate on discomfort with change in their neighborhoods, which aided the anti-immigrants to hijack that discomfort and push legislators to vote out of fear. The important thing about findings like these is not that sometimes our grantees in the heat of intense political battles are sometimes caught unprepared or outgunned. The important thing is that as in any campaign, military, political, or legislative, they learn from these experiences to do better the next time. And as we gear up to stay the course on immigration reform, despite the changed political climate, Atlantic's grantees are doing exactly that. Case studies are another form of evaluation that is particularly useful in advocacy campaigns, of which Atlantic, because of its tax status, has an unusual capacity to support legislative initiatives, is a leading funder. These include our Aging Program's North Carolina campaign for better jobs for direct care workers caring for older adults, or our Rights Program's support of indigent defense reform in Texas and other states, and our Youth Program's efforts to promote access to integrated services for middle school youth. In policy change work, there's often less documented information than available in other fields about strategies that are more successful than others, or about what strategies seem to work best in particular contexts or situations. Given this gap, we decided that case studies of successful policy efforts could provide useful models for others doing this type of work, and indeed to buttress the case for other funders to join us in public policy advocacy, which is often seen as too edgy or too soft for many donors to feel comfortable with. Our thinking was that building a library of case studies could provide a kind of checklist that could be used to assess strategy and serve as a growing resource for advocates to draw on. So what kinds of things have we learned? For example, one campaign element that has proven very important is the ability to engage strange bedfellows. In death penalty work, it could be abolition advocates from law enforcement working with abolition advocates who are family members of victims. In North Carolina, the coalition working for legislative policy to improve long-term care for older adults included a consumer group and long-term care associations. These groups had encountered one another previously only in adversarial roles. After their successful collaboration on Better Jobs, Better Care project, they started working together on another policy effort where they had a common interest, despite their different perspectives and priorities. Our hope is that multiple case studies can provide useful information on how these campaigns manage these unusual alliances. By developing cases across the areas, we ought to be able to pull out strategies that always seem useful, as well as those that work well within a particular policy area, but perhaps not in others. Because the case studies focus on state campaigns, we also hope to identify state contexts that influence how these policy efforts play out. Now, these three approaches, evaluation integrated into the work of an organization, an embedded evaluator from the outside but working closely with an organization or initiative over an extended period of time and providing contemporaneous feedback, and retrospective case studies that draw out lessons that can benefit not only the subjects of the studies but those engaged in similar work, do not constitute an exhaustive list of our approaches. And Atlantic also supports, in many instances, intensive data collection, for instance, on our efforts to reduce smoking in Vietnam, aimed at improving quality and enabling a successful program to be increased in scale and reach. And while Atlantic-supported evaluations mostly focus on our grantees' programmatic work, we also support them in strengthening their own organizational capacity. This is particularly apt when organizations are well-positioned in terms of their knowledge and experience about the work itself, but are trying to develop a stronger infrastructure in order to expand their effort, make others more aware of their work, or operate more efficiently. Sometimes organizations are considering whether a function or a role should be performed by hiring new staff or using external consultants. And in these cases, data and assessment can inform decisions about the organization itself. We're doing this, for example, for a number of groups doing essential work to combat the Bush administration's many incursions on human rights and civil liberties since September 11, 2001. Finally, I should note one other thing that is interesting and important about Atlantic's approach to evaluation. We recognize that work in certain fields, and often we play a role in building a field, as in civic engagement of older adults, requires assessments not just of individual grants or initiatives, but sometimes of groupings of grantees working towards some common objective. In another semi-violent metaphor, reminding me of ordnance, we call these cluster evaluations. We try to build communities of grantees in these clusters and provide them with regular opportunities for convening, exchange, and our eternal evaluators meet with Atlantic teams and grantees twice a year. So that's a short walk through some of the different approaches Atlantic takes to helping its grantees assess their impact and improve performance. Since one of the other distinctive things about Atlantic, as has been noticed, is that we're going out of business in 8 or 9 years, actually, so 2020, maybe a little far out. Heeding the desire of our donor and board to take our $4 billion in assets and bring it down to zero, it's particularly important for us to share the learning we are gathering, and to that end, we're about to launch a series of publications of varying length and depth to make these lessons accessible to a broad audience, and to beef up our website to make the detailed evaluation reports available to anyone who wants them. Now I want to set forth a few things to keep in mind about evaluation, or at least the way I look at it from a funder's perspective. First and foremost, evaluation should be based on a shared understanding of what is important to measure and learn. Ideally, the organization seeking funding should be asked to set forth what it thinks constitutes success, in stages or in total, how it plans to measure it, and what it needs to get it done, and the donor should be a partner in helping to support that shared judgment. Evaluation is a learning tool for the organization and the funder, not a stick to beat grantees with. And this holds true for almost all measurement efforts, from No Child Left Behind to your assistant's performance review. If evaluation is coupled with punishment, fear will overwhelm learning. Second, doing this right takes money. Hats off to organizations who do this with their own dollars because they understand its importance. But when groups have to choose between providing services and devoting resources to assessment, they often understandably give the latter short shrift. Funders should recognize and support their grantees in efforts to learn. Evaluation should not be, as Peter York put it in A Funder's Guide to Evaluation in 2005, an unfunded mandate. Or as the Stanford Social Innovation Review wrote in 2006, something that funders want to be seen doing, but not what they valued being done. Third, evaluation should measure only what is important. Data should never be collected for its own sake. The metrics obsession that has overtaken some funders in recent years has not always recognized this. More is not necessarily better. Funders should never commit the cardinal sin of making grantees jump through a series of hoops, distracting them from the actual work of advancing their core mission and costing valuable staff time, for unnecessary paperwork or reporting on trivial things. And there's nothing more demoralizing from the grantee's perspective than doing all this to have it ignored or filed away without being engaged in any way. I'm on a roll here. Fourth, make sure that whoever is conducting an evaluation understands the context in which they're working. This is particularly important when experts in one field, such as youth services, try to work in another, like social justice advocacy. In recent months, I read 2 evaluation documents about legal advocacy efforts supported by Atlantic, and perhaps because my own career in public interest law organizations makes me in this realm the man who knew too much, I was struck that one of them, written by people without much experience in the field, had a kind of a gee whiz aspect to it that few people knowledgeable about comparable efforts would have succumbed to. The other, written by 2 of South Africa's leading human rights lawyers about Atlantic-funded efforts to build the public interest law infrastructure there, was a pleasure to read because the authors combined deep experience in the field with sufficient critical distance and a knack for conveying issues that are often seen as technical to a non-technical reader. Among other things, the report cautioned against too strongly separating one area of public interest litigation from another. While it was possible to have organizations focusing on children's rights, health rights, or gay and lesbian rights, it was essential that general public interest organizations were also funded and supported in order to enable them to operate across a wide range of issues. Now, that kind of lesson is almost universally useful. Fifth, whether you're a program officer in a foundation or an executive in a nonprofit, don't use evaluation to outsource your own judgment. Use it to inform your judgment and then stand behind it. It's again worth stressing that evaluation is a tool in the quest for impact and effectiveness in everything from helping kids make a successful transition to middle school to stopping the Bush administration's embrace of torture. It is not a magic 8-ball that will tell you what to do. Sixth, and I address this both to funders and the organizations they support, have a reasonable sense of humility about cause and effect. For organizations working for social or policy change, understand that no significant change was brought about by one organization working alone. For funders, understand that the tendency of organizations to claim disproportionate credit for some policy advance has a lot to do with their need to impress funders who are too often more concerned with seeing the grantee quoted in the newspaper than with understanding the group's actual role and impact, which may be more effective behind the scenes. Funders as well are often too quick to claim credit for things that others had a hand in. And it is often not possible, particularly when the funding that is provided is not nearly enough to make the critical difference, to attribute something to the impact of one grant by one funder. When a neighborhood turns around or climate change is reversed, your $50,000 grant will have played a role, but not likely a pivotal role that can be isolated with scientific precision. And finally, I propose a 3-year moratorium on logic models, theories of change, and the like, that use geometric shapes and arrows, particularly when arranged in a circular or oval form. I've never seen one of these that is not absurdly reductionist. I just threw that in to upset people, particularly those among my own staff and consultants. But if it results in a world with fewer PowerPoint slides, I feel I will have accomplished something important in my time on Earth. Now, I promise to close with a few words for donors who may wish to step up their philanthropy, but who have been concerned about making an impact. The first thing I want to say is so obvious that it can often be forgotten, which is start with what you believe. If you have a passion about the death penalty or art programs for kids or the isolation of older people, or whatever it is, find a way to advance it and worry about what you care about first and how you measure it second. The next thing is that there's a shortage of capital for social initiatives. Proven youth mentoring programs and senior volunteer programs and legal assistance clinics, but no shortage of sound due diligence. In the youth arena alone, foundations like Edna McConnell Clark and Atlantic have a wealth of expertise and knowledge about what works, constantly refined by the kinds of sophisticated approaches to evaluation I've described above, and there's little need to recreate it or replicate it. Better to marry your capital to due diligence that you can trust. The third thing to remember is that the lessons of business, the experience of the private sector, have much to teach nonprofits, but many limitations as well. Many emerging philanthropists who have been successful in business too quickly assume that all nonprofits need to do is become more like business in order to succeed and thrive. I had in my office the other day a social justice advocate who was a little late jumping on this bandwagon, and who was touting the benefits of this approach as applied to health, reminding me that a business can't be successful unless it turns a profit. I'd argue that most enduring successful business ventures must also have social value, but it's also true that you can be successful in making money, at least for a while, by riding roughshod over community values. Look at Walmart's impact on small businesses in small towns and rural communities, or the rapacious gains of certain extractive industries. Social investments, on the other hand, can't be measured only in dollars and cents, and the bottom line has many components. Finally, I want to say, please think about engagement in policy and advocacy work as well as service organizations. All the private funding for after-school and arts programs, for community development and reentry initiatives, for clinics, legal and medical, all of it is dwarfed by the potential of government, democratically controlled and directed, unlike largely unaccountable foundations, to invest in broad community needs. Advocacy can help shape the flow of those investments, modeling programs and practices the government can learn from, but not using scarce philanthropic dollars to assume an obligation that is properly a government responsibility. Funding advocacy takes staying power and a tolerance for failure amid gains over the long haul. As Susan Hochstetter and Marcia Egbert have written in the Evaluation Exchange, a useful publication of the Harvard Family Research Project, when it comes to advocacy, flexibility is a strength, and failure to reach a big goal may actually produce important incremental gains. I usually like to end my talks with some kind of odd, pithy quote, but since I'm relatively new to the topic of evaluation, I had a hard time coming up with one. So I did with what any careful researcher would do. I went straight to Google. And I found this gem by none other than Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote in 1883, and I quote, "Evaluation is creation. Hear it, you creators. Evaluating is itself the most valuable treasure of all that we value. It is only through evaluation that value exists, and without evaluation, the nut of existence would be hollow. Hear it, you creators." There you have it, the evaluator as artist. And I think I hear a cheer going up in the offices of the American Evaluation Association. Thank you.
Don't go away. I'd like everyone who has questions to write them on your cards, and those will be collected and brought up here for Garrett to respond to. While you are doing that, I have a question. And my question has to do with failure. You know, one of the issues for everyone when you're really looking at your impact, whether it's a project or your organization, is how do you deal with reporting about the ways in which your project failed? And how do you, as a funder, look at that information, both for the grantee and for sharing knowledge with your peers?
Well, it's easy to talk about creating a climate in which failure can be acknowledged. But of course, in the real world, it's very hard to create cultures in which that is possible. So very often, like in the staff organizations I've run, very often I've said, look, we need to be talking about the grants that have not worked as well as the grants that have worked. We need to do this for the board as well, because you don't have as much credibility if you're only touting your successes. And yet, of course, unless you build a deep culture in which there's a safe place to talk about that, you get the kind of things like you heard in the presidential debates. What's your biggest weakness? I care too much about, about helping America, and I need to care less about it. So you don't always get the kind of candor that you want, and you have to really work at it. I mean, I always say at OSI when I was there before and at Atlantic, there should be no penalty for failure up to a point. You can't. I mean, I'm not suggesting that constant and unrelenting failure is what we're striving for, but I do think that if you take risks in your organization or in your funding, you're bound to fail sometimes. George Soros used to love failure in a strange way, because he reveled in learning the lessons from it. We were very active in gun violence work for a long period of time with the Aaron Diamond Foundation and a few others, and well, it didn't work very well, I guess, is a short answer. And what we did, which is another form of evaluation I didn't really mention here that I used to be more involved with at OSI, and I still like, which is hire a journalist or somebody who's knowledgeable about a field. In the case, we hired a guy named Mike Massing, who had just written a book about drug policy and who's been writing lately about Iraq. Very respected journalist. Didn't know anything about gun control as such, but he knew a lot about organizations and political change and so on. I said to him, go talk to anybody you want to involved in the effort, and write something that we won't censor, and address our role as well as the role of the grantees. And he did, and some of what I read was quite uncomfortable in terms of mistakes that I had made. Now, Rana, I think one of the things you're getting at, which is not something I've figured out very well, is when you're talking about a grantee foundation relationship, the public sharing of failure is not only the foundation's failure. And so that's a little sensitive, So to be transparent, I mean, I actually mentioned in this talk a few things pertaining to grantees' efforts that didn't work out. Now, in many cases, those were shared faults or even primary faults of the funder. But if somebody says to me, what's my biggest mistake at OSI, I know what that is. I can think of a particular grant that I wish we hadn't made, that we made a number of mistakes on, but we also invested in the wrong people. But to be publicly transparent about that implicates not just, it's easy to acknowledge your own mistakes, but it's a little harder to acknowledge somebody else's mistakes. And so I think that is an area that requires a lot more work, and we're going to have to grapple with that at Atlantic as we be more transparent about putting up the raw evaluations on the website, which I'm committed to doing as much as we can. You want to, as I say, to the extent that you have public exposure, there's an element of shaming that goes somewhat against what I'm saying about no punishment. And so how to be transparent about that in a way that isn't hurtful is an issue. I see you now have a lot of cards.
We have many questions. An interesting question. What's going to happen, whether it's 2016, 2020, whatever the right year is, with all of the case studies, the learning, the knowledge that Atlantic has developed when you, in fact, do go out of business?
Well, I don't know. I just got there 10 months ago. And I learned the other day that no email we've ever sent in 12 years has been deleted, so apparently it'll all be around. I think that, look, in general terms, because the challenge of a spend-down foundation, while not unique, is unusual. And Atlantic, probably not since Julius Rosenwald, the Sears Roebuck founder, spent a great deal of money and went out of business in the early part of the 20th century, has a foundation at the scale of Atlantic gone out of business. I mean, we have some good examples of spend-down foundations, Aaron Diamond, which had a great impact over 10 years in New York City, the Belden Fund, which is spending down now, the Olin Foundation, which I just mentioned. But at the scale of Atlantic, nothing really like it. So I found in coming here that while, as you can see, we've given a lot of thought to a lot of things, there hasn't been a lot of thought about the exit strategy. So, and we're really just now beginning to accumulate these knowledge projects and make them public. So one of the things I'm committed to doing in the coming year is to begin what you might call end-of-life planning, which is to say, what does the end look like, or what could it look like? There's a lot of different ways to go. You can spend, just kind of in a crude way, we say we're going to spend down, you can look at it as a pile of money that gets down to nothing. There may be other ways to do it. We may support key grantees with endowments. We may spin off some entities. We have a serious obligation to the fields in which we're dominant to be very, very careful about the impact of our leaving. And I'm talking today in this context about the United States, where we loom large in some areas like aging, where we're the biggest funder on aging probably in the world, but are somewhat more, have many more partners, let's say, in youth work. But globally, the 7 other countries in which Atlantic operates, we are the largest funder. And in countries with very relatively little tradition, many of them, of philanthropy like the United States, and that's an even heavier obligation. So there'll be an archive someplace. I'll give it some thought, but I'll put that on my list for the...
I was out of all of these questions, 1/2 of them are about general operating support, not surprisingly. So I think the gist of many of them are, how can you help support in the field in general a greater trend towards general operating support, and what are your thoughts about how you work with evaluation in the context of general operating support grants?
Well, at OSI and here, I've always seen my role and Atlantic's role more broadly as trying to use the platform that we have to advance our mission and the kind of practices we believe in. So on the one hand, I rarely talk about wonky topics like evaluation. Mostly I like to talk about human rights or things like that. And so I think that someone in the position of a funder, which while unaccountable is also got a kind of a license, untethered by the market, to speak out, unlike, let's say, university presidents who increasingly have to worry about their donors. I like to use the platform to throw a spotlight on the work of our grantees, but that also extends to the practices that we support. So I've, long and hard spoken out on the benefits of general operating support and multi-year support, and participated in a lot of efforts to that end. And by doing that today, I want to kind of add my voice to that. So Atlantic look, philanthropy is pluralistic. We're spending down. It's not for everybody. I'm not here to say everybody should spend down. There's a very strong case to be made for what the Ford Foundation or Rockefeller or Carnegie does in having endowment money that lasts over generations or even centuries, soon in the case of Carnegie and Rockefeller, and being strong to meet the challenges of one generation after another. There are arguments to be made on both sides. I'm not here to say that philanthropy shouldn't be pluralistic. There are some funders who either don't have the capacity to provide general operating support or it wouldn't make as much sense. But I do think that more funders should think about that because, look, Ron asked, what's most important to, list in my introduction. I said I don't really care. But I guess what I do care that people know about is that I spent the first half of my life raising money and running organizations. And I'm on the boards of organizations now that raise money because, there's a great occupational hazard in philanthropy, which is to become remote from that very fact and forget what it's like. So I'm always thinking and asking, what is it like for the people who want our money or are getting our money? How can we streamline the processes as much? And it's very hard to get good and candid feedback on that. So I believe very strongly in that, and I'll continue to. So I know what it's like to be running an organization and to have to fit your strategies into the strategies of a foundation. So what you have is a situation where foundations have every right and indeed obligation to be strategic. They need to say, what are you about? What do you want to achieve? you have to have a plan. Everybody has to have a strategy for life. Nobody throws money at the wall or should throw money at the wall. But when you're living, and most of you or many of you run nonprofit organizations or raise money for nonprofit organizations, you don't wake up in the morning and think of worry about Atlantic Philanthropy strategy or what the Ford Foundation strategy or the Robin Hood Foundation strategy is. That's not you. Your job is to convince us that your work, aligns with our strategy. And you don't feel that the Ford Foundation or the Atlantic Philanthropies is the center of the universe in which you are fitting into their plan. You feel that you're doing your work, and if it aligns with our work, that's great. Now, I could complain for a long time, and I would in another setting, about how annoying it is to have people try to distort their work so that it looks like it fits with your work when really it doesn't. There's a lot of wasted time that goes on there. But the effort is valiant, and I did it myself for many, many years. So the point I'm making is that you have to, if you're sitting where I'm sitting, you have to be thinking about what it's like to be on the other side of it. And what it's like to be on the other side of it is that you have a mission, you want to pursue it. If you're running an effective organization, you want to be trusted by the donor to carry out your mission and respond to changing realities as we see fit. And the right kind of partnership is one in which that is recognized. There is an alignment overall, but it is recognized that the foundation is not in the driver's seat. You're an enabler of the work of others. Now, finally, that does have some really interesting implications for the general support question, particularly for a smaller foundation who gives 50,000 general support to a $3 million organization. How do you evaluate that? That argues, in my view, for one of the things I haven't talked about was greater collaboration among foundations. You'd be amazed, or maybe you wouldn't be, some of you are from foundations, how little shared due diligence there is among foundations. I mean, how much replication there is, how infrequently foundations talk to one another, when they're funding something similar. It's astounding because foundations have, many of them, the disease of not invented here, and we're not interested if we didn't invent it. And I'm trying to also, while exercising what leadership we can, also model good collaborative behavior. So the Open Society Institute, where I used to work, and I was succeeded by Ann Beeson, who's a longtime colleague of mine, one of the leading people in the country on civil liberties issues. Post 9/11, she has a plan for a multi-year campaign to reverse the Bush administration's policies. It's a very good plan. We were thinking about the same thing. We've been in that area for the last 3 years or 5 years ourselves. And I said to our staff, well, why should we have our independent strategy? Let's kind of back OSI's strategy and come in with an equivalent amount of money. We don't have to own that if it's a good strategy. And you don't see very much of that in foundations. It's also something I want to encourage. So I think that the kind of a way toward the assessment of the organizational effectiveness with general support is probably more collaborative evaluation efforts among foundations. I don't know what the time is, but I don't want to.
We have many more.
Okay.
We have many more questions than actually we're going to have time for. There are a couple of questions that deal with what I'll call the dichotomy between foundations wanting good metrics, to use something that you refer to, and good proof that your program or something is succeeding and has a track record, and the desire of foundations to fund what is new and just started. And do you have any reflections on that?
Well, I wouldn't have thought there's an inherent tension in those two things, but maybe there is. I mean, I think as I say, with the question of metrics, which is not one of my favorite words, but I haven't come up with a better one. So we expect with the general question of metrics or measures, or benchmarks, whatever term you want to use. As I say, I think the important thing about those is that the dance of grant making should be an exchange between the people who want money from a foundation and the foundation about what are they trying to achieve and how do you want to measure it. And it's a shared understanding. It's not something imposed upon the grantee, which doesn't mean that you wouldn't have in a good candid relationship a back and forth or disagreement or a foundation pushing or the grantee pushing back. It just means that it's crazy either not to think about how you're going to measure something when you start funding it, or to impose measures after the fact or unilaterally. It's just crazy. So the other part of that question, though, which was about foundations wanting to do something new and different, which almost by definition is less proven, that's a problem. I came in. you will note that Atlantic Philanthropies has not yet changed very much of what it does. I've been there a year. So by some normal measure, I'm not making much of an impact on the place because I haven't fired half the staff and reorganized the programs to look different. But I actually felt that the basic, we only have 9 years to go. The broad areas in which we're engaged are really important ones. It doesn't make much sense to abandon aging or human rights and take up climate change for us, or for that matter, to work in different countries where we've built up a lot of expertise on which we're reliant. So the idea that we would exit, I don't know, Vietnam and go into Nigeria doesn't make much sense to me. We are looking very carefully at the particular strategic objectives within the broad baskets, and some of those might change or not. But I'm trying to do it in an organic way because, I know that I want to resist the temptation to kind of mark my territory, by putting my stamp on the place, by relabeling the programs and announcing all, which is, by the way, sometimes justified. I don't mean to be implicitly or explicitly critical of some of my colleagues. It's just that very often I think there's a fetish for newness that doesn't really serve the field. And all of you have lived with the capriciousness of foundations that decide to exit an area or to freeze their grant making for 2 years while they study what to do and so on. And so, now look, at the same time, foundations have to be responsive to new realities, So you want foundations, both new ones that come online with new priorities and old ones, not to be set in their ways. And one of the things I'm trying to do about Atlantic, where I am trying to put my stamp on it, as it were, is that, I want to deepen our work in the areas in which we're involved and go deeper into what's working and maybe pull back a little bit about things that aren't working where we don't have as much of a capacity for impact. And we know a bit about that now, 3 or 4 years into that. But I also want us to be able to be more flexible. We have this unusual capacity to fund advocacy that most foundations don't. We can fund and do fund lobbying campaigns and even some electoral activity like ballot initiatives. And it seems to me that in the world in which we live, particularly if we have an opportunity next year for some positive reform with a new administration, which and in some of the issues I'm talking about, a McCain administration on civil liberties issues would provide many opportunities for reform. So it's not just a question of whether a Democrat is elected president. But one way or another, the landscape will change. There may be quite significant opportunities for policy change that haven't existed in at least 16 years. And it seems to me that we are obligated to be as proactive about that as possible. So I think you have to maintain some balance between stability and flexibility. But I do accept that it is that the desire of foundations. I mean, I'll say one other thing, and I'm giving long-winded answers, but there's a dynamic. I don't know if it happens as much on the nonprofit side, but in foundations, which is people get bored funding the same things all the time, and so it's like. When you start a new foundation, when I started OSI, we had big piles of money, and everything was like a kid in a candy store. Let's do this and this and this. And you get to this point in a couple of years' time where you basically, if you want, you do have a tension between new things and stable commitments to grantees. And so I've never believed in this 3 years and out kind of thing. Which is. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps and so on. That's what the liberal foundations, the conservatives, by the way, are very happy to fund you forever. But the liberal foundations are like, well, you have to, stand on your own 2 feet. So they kind of switch political roles as funders. Anyway.
I think that's actually a great spot to end. We have many, many more questions, but we don't have time for them. I want to thank you for what's been an incredibly thoughtful and direct conversation which to begin this conference. So please join me in thanking Gara for his... We've only gone over by 2 minutes, so you have an 8-minute break right now.
As most of you probably remember, the New York Community Trust and the United Way of New York City joined together to create the September 11 Fund in those very difficult and trying days after the disaster, the tragedy of 9/11. And Safe Horizons was really a safe horizon for us in the sense that that organization, under Gordon's leadership, was the go-to organization and was responsible really for implementing and distributing, I think, over $114 million in assistance to family members, to victims, and to other people who were impacted by that disaster. And I can't tell you how, as someone who was somewhat involved in helping make the decisions that led to those grants and those awards to families and victims going out, to know that we had such a capable organization with such integrity and such competence to count on to do that was really comforting to us in a very emotional time. And in this day and age when people who try to do good things are under a microscope for, screwing something up or doing something wrong, Al Gore is criticized for flying a Lear jet, to say now, 7 years later, that all of that money was dispersed, there has never been any question about any of the decisions that were made, is really a testament to Gordon's leadership. And so I'm really pleased to introduce Gordon Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat, for the kind introduction, and it's such a privilege for me and for United Way of New York City to be able to partner on so many initiatives over the years and going forward with the New York Community Trust. And Claire, I really want to thank you for your leadership in the Better Business Bureau for pulling this together. And Claire said, I wish we had a bigger space. I said, well, that's a good sign. Next year you can go to that much larger of a venue. So David will have to find, Dean Birdsall, a larger space at Baruch, hopefully. And Gara, I just really want to thank Gara for his remarks, and I talked to a number of people that I think resonated with virtually all of us in this room in terms of strategic learning for both successes and learning from mistakes. We cannot be risk adverse. We need to be bold, and at times we will make mistakes. And that evaluation is a learning tool, not a stick, that it takes dollars, and we need to evaluate only what is important. I have to tell you, those messages really resonated with me. And let me, without further ado, introduce our three panelists. To my far left is someone I've known for many years, Marilyn Gelber, the Executive Director of the Independent Community Foundation, which focuses on community development, education, culture and arts, and economic and workforce development in the New York metropolitan area. And the most important thing, Marilyn, through her leadership and through the foundation, has and continues to be a vibrant force in this community. And next to Marilyn is my friend and colleague, Lillian Rodriguez-Lopez, President of the Hispanic Federation, a nonprofit organization serving over 90 Latino and Latina health and human service agencies in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. And Lillian, through her leadership, has and continues, speaking of impact, makes such an impact. And to my immediate left is Peter York, the Vice President and Director of Evaluation, the TCC Group, a consulting firm that helps nonprofits, philanthropies, and corporate citizenship programs. And I've had the opportunity to work with TCC back in 1999 when I was at Safe Horizon, and most recently now at United Way of New York City. And Gara mentioned this. Peter just published a book which was published in 2005 entitled A Funder's Guide to Evaluation, Leveraging Evaluation to Improve Nonprofit Effectiveness. And for us, it's a real pleasure to co-sponsor this symposium with the New York Community Trust because it really resonates with our work at United Way, work that we're engaged upon and really moving towards as a community problem solver. And this is something that we all are concerned about, to really getting at the root causes of problems that communities are facing. I was just talking during the break to Lucy Friedman about that. Building partnerships, as Gara said, no one organization can do it alone, and creating measurable, lasting change. So from a programmatic perspective, but also from a systems perspective. So the key questions are, what leads to impact? How do we measure impact? And what can we learn about impact? We've got about 40 minutes, and we want to have time for questions and answers, so let's begin. So Peter, I'm going to start with you. And the first question is, in this session, is what can we learn about impact? And it's really the foundational one. People use that word, but what do we mean by it?
I think this is a very important fundamental question, and I think one of the problems and challenges with the whole concept of impact is that we all define impact not the same way. It's like the concept of community or collaboration. It's very interesting to hear the differences of definition and what we talk about. And I think the way I'd like to talk about impact in the context of what we're talking about here is there's a tie-in to impact and accountability that comes along with the word impact often in terms of, and even in the philanthropic community, how we talk about investing in impact. And I think one of the challenges is there's almost an irony that happens, and I think that it affects everything. It affects how we use evaluation, how we learn. It affects where we're held accountable. And there's an irony that I find that's very interesting to me, and that is when we really talk about impact, if you think about broadly sectors, for-profit, non-profit, it's very interesting that in the for-profit sector, impact gets measured, and where investments are made are in truly short-term outcomes. When it really comes down to it, it's consumer behavior, and all that they do and all they focus on. And by the way, I think they learn a great amount about how to do that because of being held accountable by investors for that immediate outcome. We don't ask of the business community, which by far, in my opinion, beyond government and the nonprofit sector, has the greatest social impact. We don't ask the question, what's the social impact? Where do you measure it? And impact often, when we define it broadly, has to do with these community measures of economic, health, education. We talk about these big measures. And in the philanthropic and the nonprofit sector, the interesting thing is we talk about community impact at those levels and express in the work that we do and the work that we invest in at that impact level. But the real challenge is that in the nonprofit sector, from a measurement and accountability standpoint, we don't really measure where the investment truly lies, which is on actually affecting impact on the individuals, families being served on the ground. I mean, I was a caseworker for the homeless, and if you ask me about impact, what I really talked about was being able to get people fed, clothed, perhaps to a job, and hopefully in stable housing. But there's only so much I controlled, and there's only so much our program and services could control. So when it really comes down to it, impact is one of those things in terms of who's defining it. And I think it's a very interesting model we work in where some of the greatest social impacts that can occur, the investments on the for-profit side, we hold the accountability question really at the short-term outcomes, but we don't do that in the nonprofit sector where we're really needing to think about impact at the short term and really the immediate effect, and then asking the aggregate question, and that's a research question at the community impact level.
Marilyn, your thoughts?
Very interesting, Peter. The one thing I would say about impact is that to us, it's not a static measurement. Impact is movement. Impact is change. Impact is influence. And what Peter is saying is that, and I think it's quite right, that if you really want to affect change, there are a lot of sectors in our life that affect that, be it the public sector, government. Obviously, there is tremendous money, power, and influence in government, and how does it evaluate what it does? The business environment, clearly the impact of business ripples through our country in very profound ways. The notion that business is evaluated on short-term goals, whereas we hold our nonprofit partners to sort of change the world goals, much broader goals, when in fact the work they do will have an immediate impact, but it's also complicated because there are so many other factors at work. I think it's important, and I'll speak from the perspective of a foundation, I think it's important when we assess impact or plan for change that both the foundation and the organizations to whom they give grants, that there be some agreement up front on what the expected impact might be. Sometimes it's statistical, but maybe more broadly it's this question of change and of pushing towards a change that the work of that organization can have a pretty big effect on. For example, and I'll be brief, I happen to see someone in the audience from Habitat New York City. Nearly 10 years ago, Habitat New York City was not really producing much by way of urban habitat model, was not building here. They had the name, they had the cachet, but had not had much effect in New York City, did not quite know how to build in an urban environment. We decided at the outset we would have a long, multi-year relationship with lots of money up front in order to help them create an urban habitat model. Now, when you look at the landscape of New York City, there are other organizations that have built far more housing. And yet, what Habitat has done, and we agreed up front, what we were trying to do has been profound, to create housing opportunities, ownership opportunities for low-income people in a way that did not exist in the city before. So the only point here is that you change the world both on the ground. You have to sort of have an evaluation and an impact sense, both that's street and cerebral. You have to understand the big issues, but understand the environment and the context in which you're working, and you agree up front how you're going to evaluate that later on.
Lillian?
Thank you. I want to thank Marilyn for that, because somebody asked me the other day, had I changed the world? And I was like, not yet. And, you know, imagine doing what we do at the Federation, which is we're a capacity builder. So people are constantly asking us, what's your impact? What are your metrics? And so now all I want to talk about is outcomes and metrics. And when you look at organizations, I want to just take a little bit of just move the needle a little bit, is in my world and in the organizations that I'm dealing with, when I measure impact, I have to look at scale. And I have to see specifically what's distinctive about what these organizations want to do or these organizations are doing that makes it special and different from perhaps what 1,000 other groups are doing and have the budgets and the staff and the resources to mount the programs, but still don't have the outcomes or the impact that we'd like to see in our community. Specifically, I'm talking about the Hispanic community. And I want to give you a very quick example, Gordon and my other panelists. Recently, last weekend, we launched a program on college prep and financing in partnership with our network. Someone said, but there's all these people that are doing that, nationally, regionally, locally, college prep and financing, everyone's looking at that. And I'm arguing, but they're not reaching the Hispanic community. They're not reaching the Spanish-dominant, newly arrived, Latino. So what's the difference? The difference is the language, that they're offered totally in Spanish. The difference is the familiarity with the organization and the trust. I'm going to go in there. They're not going to sell me anything. They're not going to ask me anything. They're not going to push me anything. And I'm not going to feel dumb because I'm not as sophisticated about college and a college entrance as other parents might be in the public school that I go into, and it's going to be totally culturally competent. Now, we didn't have 300 people in that room, my friends. We had 30, but there was impact. And if I was to tell you that several parents raised their hands and said, what's a counselor? What do you mean there's a counselor in a high school? Now, we spend millions of dollars, right, in these kinds of programs. The Board of Ed has major parental engagement programs. We're supposed to be sending out all of this information. We have internet. How is it that 3 or 4 parents raise their hands and say, what's a counselor? There's someone that's supposed to help us in the school. So when we look at impact, what I'm trying to say is it can be very modest and it can be very distinctive. And I agree with Marilyn, we have to look, and when we're negotiating, because it is a negotiation, when we are negotiating with that organization and deciding what we're going to fund, let's set up those metrics and those values and that baseline at the very beginning, because it may not be a quantum leap, but they should be moving the needle and we should be seeing a change. And really, in order to really measure the impact, it has to be something that's also sustainable. It can't be, let's do it for 12 months, see if it works, and then walk away from the table.
So let me just, and I agree with everything everyone said, but let me just push a little. Peter, you talked about that business is short-term goals, but there's expectation as what's happening from a longitudinal perspective. Marilyn, you talked about street versus cerebral. And Lillian, you talked about modest impact is something that we cannot neglect, and it's just as important, and one could argue even more important. But then you look at our funders, whether it be government or foundation and education, It doesn't matter, the focus could be after school, but what's happening in terms of test scores. In terms of homelessness, it's not just was that family safe, but what have you done to get them permanent housing and a job so they're out of the homeless system and off of the public dole. In terms of seniors, it's not just meals, but what's happening from a health perspective and a safety perspective. More and more funders want to see that, and we can all say that we understand what the reality is, but I think what we're up against is more what I'm describing, at least for the next while. So I'd like to get people's reactions.
And I have no intention here of being provocative, but I might be a little bit here, because I think that part of the challenge and the pushback on the question has to do with this concept of modest. Because I would argue that what Lillian just described as an example of, in terms of just knowledge of a counselor, their role and understanding how they can help your family, might not be modest to them. So I think it's really who's saying it's modest. And I think that the struggle that I see as somebody who works with so many nonprofits, so many foundations, and corporations in the whole social impact world is that we're not coming together, the philanthropic sector, those on the ground doing the work and everything, around what is modest and thinking about redefining what that modest means. And I think part of the challenge is it's really going to be a struggle to get to a place, and I think it was alluded to earlier this morning, which is that, you know, there's a lot of stuff at the philanthropic level that I still think harkens back to the idea of putting names on buildings. I don't mean to be provocative about it, but it's the kind of idea where there's a paradigm, I think, that happens, and nonprofits are complicit in this, because it's kind of like we all say we're going to change the world, and we want to change the world, and we want to put our tag on it. We want to put our name on it. But when we're talking about community change, really what we're really talking about is the what is now defined as modest, but I think for those receiving services is not modest if it's effective, is really on the ground, one by one. It takes a village. You know, it's really being able to redefine and almost re-own that it's not modest. It's actually very impactful. The work I did as a caseworker, I didn't think was modest when I saw some of the immediate changes. And so I think we have to think about that to get down to the idea of metrics, what we measure. And I'll go one step further and say if we continue to look at that as modest, we'll never actually learn best practices. Because the truth is, the further out we go in measuring community impact as a result of our program, the more difficult it's going to be if we don't get closer to the intervention in terms of what we measure on outcome side, the more difficult it's going to be to ever learn what works. Because the truth of the matter is, kids going to college requires huge numbers of variables: community, parental, family, cultural, and no one program, no one philanthropic initiative is going to change all of those needles. And so I think if we can't get closer, we're never going to get to the question, what do we do programmatically to get more and more of what we now label as modest gains, I would label from the client side as not a modest gain. And we really haven't answered that question. It's the reason that there isn't replication to where we would like to see, and that we really haven't been able to think beyond 3-year initiatives. If we really knew what success was and redefined it in that space, I think it would be a very different discussion.
If I can jump in at this point, because both Gordon and I have backgrounds in government, and it's Lillian's example of parents who should be the beneficiaries of a Department of Ed that spends roughly $14 billion a year on a whole variety of things, and here are these parents raising their hand and saying, I don't know about counseling. We know that the system works for some and not for others. At NIRAG, we have something called the City Connect Committee, which is really focused on bringing philanthropy and public policy closer together. Because I would argue that this so-called modest success is an important learning moment for us to now take that knowledge of what isn't necessarily working very well for certain families and try to do the kind of advocacy and policy work that I think Gara was talking about. This is complicated stuff. It's all interdependent. And I think funders, nonprofits, you look at what's happening on the ground and then, yes, you work to address those needs, but at the same time, I don't think you're doing your job well if you don't then try to elevate it a bit and take it to the public policy and advocacy level. That's when I think you have the most effective philanthropy.
Yeah, I guess I'm reacting to both what Peter and Marilyn said. I want to go back and say again, it's not just what, the term of whether something is modest or not. It's really about scale. If we walk away with anything from this particular session, it would be to really take a look at the organization, see what your investment as a funder has been in the organization or a particular project, and help them develop some measurements, some outcomes that are realistic based on the project model and what the organization is attempting to do in terms of the service delivery. Because I think that's where sometimes we have a real disconnect, where we invest 15, 20, whatever the amount is in the organization, and it's like, well, what happens? And it's because we haven't had a very honest conversation at the beginning about what the organization is really attempting to do. What are the services they're hoping to provide? What is the change that they want to make, either inside their own infrastructure or whether or not it's direct service delivery, and help them come up with some measurements or some goals that are very, very realistic, but that satisfy them and meet the community, but will also satisfy you as the funder, because I understand we work very closely. It's interesting that Peter made the comment about sort of the foundation world and also corporations. The Federation works with both sectors very well. It is very, very different. Most of my corporate partners are coming to me with cause-related marketing. I hope that the majority of you in the foundation world, in the traditional sense, realize how difficult that is, because that's a totally different ask. That's a totally different program. They want to do good, but they're looking for brand and they're looking for market. And then on a nonprofit, it creates, okay, how do I make sure that I maintain my mission and my integrity? But you can create those measurements and those metrics for them, and they have no problems, and I have no problem sitting across a table and saying, at the end of the day, how will you measure this success? And I will tell you, can I meet those needs that you have?
So, Peter, you talked about how modest still can be impactful, and that from that we don't need to walk away from that because there's so much that can be learned in terms of best practices, in terms of approach. And Marilyn, you're saying essentially, take what we're learning on the street and move to that cerebral level and really try to be advocates and really banding together and saying that there needs to be a new day. And Lillian, to your point, is think about scalability and also to be realistic. We've all gotten, and now I'm in the position of providing grants of $20,000 grants. It's like they want me to do this for $20,000. And the question I have for all of you is both from a granting perspective as well as from a recipient perspective. At one point, and I'm actually on the board of the Citizens Advice Bureau, and we of late are having these discussions again and again, is it worth our while, even though this is what we're all about, there's a clear mission fit, but the expectations are such, there aren't the dollars for the evaluation piece, what they're expecting us to produce is going to be very difficult. But on the other hand, there's such a need, and this happens to be the South Bronx, and it's got our name written all over it. What does one do?
Well, here's where I will borrow some best practices from the for-profit side, which is I think when you look at any investment, and if you're going to make a grant, I think we need to first of all get better at supporting the capacity to do, in the analogy, the product research. By that I mean our programs and services, and this takes some doing on the nonprofit side, because I work with a lot of nonprofits and was inside them. We sometimes don't like to unpack our programs. We say they're good because we know they're good, and we want to always talk about outcomes. But what we need to do is actually invest in product research. And by that I mean measure the outcomes that are achievable. Make sure the bar is high enough, but measure outcomes that are achievable and begin to do what I always call the arrow work between the strategy and the outcome. Measure your program quality and quantity. Measure it in detail. You can develop quantitative and qualitative metrics and do the most important thing, which is talk about what are the program elements that are key to the success of achieving achievable outcomes. If we can begin to invest in organizations' capacity to do that, we're going to get far. And I think part of the way to do that is also for nonprofits to start to divorce themselves from the idea that your programs are unique. I think what we need to do is have, and I'm doing work right now in other parts of the country where we are bringing 6, 8, a group of organizations in the same community competing for the same dollars together to develop common metric systems on this product research concept. And it's actually a partnership with one of the United Ways. It's out in Arizona. And really looking at the idea of having them, because it's going to build their capacity. Because part of the problem with evaluation and why we don't learn is we don't invest in product research, which is a shame. The for-profit world would never not do that. But the other aspect is we really don't spend the time understanding truly what works, and we have to ask the right questions. And we also, because we compete, want to divorce our programs from other programs. But if we can come together and begin to develop some common metrics, I think that's when we can, in aggregate, get to that community impact level. But we have to do some investment in product research.
Well, okay, we're taking the same order. I'm thinking about your not hypothetical question about an organization in the South Bronx that I take it from what you said has the opportunity to get a sizable grant, but needs to be able to show that it will perform based on the standards that those who might give you the grant, and yet there's no money for it. To me, it partially comes back to this question of how you tell your story and whether you talk about product research. Frankly, the most effective organizations are those that can do certain quantitative analysis. You know, what are the numbers? How many are you serving? Some good story about the impact that you're having on people, but at the same time, being able to tell the individual story. I can think of one nonprofit that we funded for some years and watching how they've evolved and how effective. And interestingly, they've worked with Edna McConnell Clark on some of the metrics. But what makes a difference is actually being able to tell the individual story of the impact while they're doing all this metric analysis. So for a group in the South Bronx, I think being able to describe the context, the environment, agreeing up front with your funder, they have a point of view, you have a point of view, and I think agreeing on some sensible measurements, which include both quantitative and other kinds of narrative elements, and being able to tell your story effectively, I think is critical for many human service nonprofits in particular.
I just want to say I think it's a different question too, and I think that's the shift that we have to have as a sector. And it's beginning, and we've been hearing a lot about outcomes and measurements and evaluation, and lots of people are becoming, many funders, even in government, much more forceful about it. But it really is a different question. Usually people are used to being asked, how many events, how many activities, how many bodies, how many units of service? And then, you know, I don't want to say, but Libby, hi Libby. Libby's a funder of the Federation. She's helping us with our conference center. It's a different question to say, Lillian, how many people did you have in the conference center? And Lillian, what was the impact for the groups that came in and used that conference center? And that's about moving a needle for them and for us. And so it is a dialogue, and it's not easy because we're used to just measuring things. And that's where we are like, in a sense, like corporations, because it's like, well, how many things did you sell? How many boxes left the store? Well, it's not about boxes in our business, and that's why it's going to take a little bit of time to really get it into the culture of our sector.
I also think Peter's, story about his casework history and the impact that he made with his casework, he knows it. He lived it. He saw it. To me, it is critically important to get your funders out, to get your funders to see what you see in some context. I mean, the world of philanthropy in New York City is pretty concentrated, and I think it is critically important for an organization in the South Bronx to really put time and energy into getting some of the foundation people out to spend time with you. Then their evaluation will be fairer, and your own sense of their sense of impact, I think, will be much more coherent.
I mean, Marilyn, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of and I know it resonates with so many people here in terms of it's one thing to talk about programs or submit a report, and it's another thing to see it up close. And Peter, your point about investing in capacity was what Rhonda was talking about in terms of questions for Gara, is that, it's always a struggle in terms of general operating expenses. It's something, those dollars are so near to our heart, but they're also the most difficult to get. And then, Marilyn, your point is it's not just the quantitative piece, but telling those individual stories in terms of individuals, families, and communities. And Lillian, your point is an understanding that it is a new day. It's not just, we no longer can just count. As much as we might want to, we've got to be able to push ourselves forward. And Lillian, you and I have had this question any number of times, because we can talk about what government's not doing for us, what the foundation world's not doing for us, but from a not-for-profit perspective, what do we need to do to really have an honest assessment with ourselves organizationally and say, you know what, this program's had a good run, or maybe it hasn't, we need to put it to bed, what have you. How do we take some ownership as well from a service provider perspective? I'm wearing my old hat.
That's a scary question for most people because, sometimes people want to exist in perpetuity. Sometimes they feel that they're so good at what they do, they haven't looked at sort of the communities and the people that they're caring for and see that, they've changed or the needs have grown or they've shifted. I think it's a good question for me because when the Federation funds or regrants, we really focus on, capacity building. So it's really looking back, allowing the organization to look back at the work that they're doing from an infrastructure lens, right? I'm not looking at your programs, I'm looking at your infrastructure. And I think that part of the problem is that most organizations need an opportunity to step back, assess their programs and services, do some strategic planning. I'm not sure I like your word, Peter, of product research, but good. I'm glad you're borrowing it because I'm one of those people who's like anti-CEO as the head of a federation, a nonprofit also. But I do have the title of president, but I didn't make it. But the thing is, executive director is perfectly fine. But it's the concept of we need to also put more resources, I have to say this, into these organizations so people have the ability to take a step back, really assess their programs and services, their staffing, the geography, what their clients really need, and look at it. People are running just way too fast. And when you have an executive who's also the chief development person and also doing external relations, and most of the organizations are only about providing services and the person that comes in the door and what do they need and who's the next person and what's the next thing. And that's what we're encouraging people. You need to take a step back. Something that we're going to begin that we need to look at in the sector also is where can we have consolidations, where can we have mergers, where can we have enhancements around certain agencies and certain programs so that people are just doing things collaboratively, in alliance, and so that we don't have the problems where we see so many organizations that are struggling and not able to provide perhaps the quality of service that we'd like them to have. They never reach scale, quite frankly, some of them.
Speaking of being provocative.
Let me jump in because I think from a grant maker's perspective, I'm a big believer in what I call fact-based philanthropy. I think you have to continuously look at data. You have to look at numbers. You have to look at where there are issues, where there are problems that remain unaddressed. And that leads you sometimes to a conclusion that, and not that an organization isn't doing their job, has done their job, and maybe now it's time for me as a funder to look somewhere else. and I'll give you, and some organizations sort of really understand that themselves. For example, in the area of food and hunger, there are some large organizations actually here in Manhattan on the Bowery who concluded that now there are NYU dormitories on the Bowery and 600 homeless people lining up for meals there. Maybe they should try to understand where people are really coming from. And they did their analysis and concluded that, my goodness, there are all of these neighborhoods in southern Brooklyn, around Coney Island, for example, where there clearly is a need and very little going on to address it. And so this is an organization that saw it help to shift their, not the focus of what they do. The work will remain, but in fact, they understand that their landscape is changing, and so they want to begin to change with it and address problems that they see on the ground. And I, have tremendous respect for organizations that do that level of self-evaluation.
I think just to build off of this really quickly is well, first of all, product research is the analogy, and I'm actually a bigger fan of what I call program learning or service learning. And that can be policy advocacy work or on-the-ground direct service and the other range of services nonprofits provide.
I really like you.
I think what we need to do, it's analogous to, and my point is that we don't do it. And I think that one of the other challenges is when we make decisions about programs, I've evaluated so many programs and initiatives for funders throughout the country, and I can tell you that no one program works or doesn't work. It's not at a program level that we should be asking questions of whether we should keep it or pull the plug. We have to be willing in the nonprofit sector to dissect our programs, because so many times, and this is the competitive market that's put us into this position in some ways, and I think there's some healthiness to some competition, but at the same time, I think we need to unpack our programs, and I think we need to look at an elemental level. And what we need to do, if we can understand what elements or ingredients of our program really matter to the success of getting outcomes or impact, and realistic ones, achievable ones, then what I think we can begin to do when down the pike funding changes, which is the big reason why programs end, by the way. It's usually not the nonprofit that's asking these questions. They're not saying we want to get rid of the program. But I think what they are responsible to do is to say, if we did lose funding or we had a cutback, where would we cut? And it shouldn't be a decision to say cut the program, especially if a population is in need of service that can't get anywhere else. It should be, what are the core elements of this program that are absolutely necessary to make this work? And if we have to cut back, we have to go for other funding, we have a better case to make for what we're asking for. And so we're not losing the elements, the ingredients of success, because we always think in our program, because that's what we sell.
I think Peter's point is a good one. It's not just about any one particular initiative, any one program at a not-for-profit, because no one nonprofit in this day and age, I firmly believe, can do it by itself. It's a not-for-profit world. It's the foundation world. It's government and corporate, all of us coming together to really say, where are we at and how can we solve these problems? Or said, Ron, I've got the challenge of too many questions, but really good questions. But I've got 3 questions that I want to ask the panel. Why rely on nonprofits to measure impact? Of course they'll be biased. Why not create mechanisms to ask the end users who is being effective? And any one of you?
I like the idea of asking the end users. Some of you may be aware Community Service Society did some very interesting, unique work called the Unheard Third, where they took the approach that instead of sort of smart policy people deciding what were the issues confronting poor people in the city, they would ask people themselves, what keeps you up at night, and such like that. And I have tremendous respect for that kind of work. At the same time, I don't think that is a substitute for a nonprofit that deeply knows their work to be asked to evaluate it. I don't think it's either or, really.
I would say the same thing. I really don't think we're in a situation where asking the nonprofit to measure it is a bad thing. But I think the question is really getting at who do you get the data from? And I totally believe that if we're ever going to learn anything about our programs, and all the evaluation work that I do, we gather the information from the users, even about program quality and how much they're using and what they're doing. We don't ask the staff that. You ask the people that are using it. You're not going to learn if it's self-report because, frankly, we're all flawed in our assumptions. Some are right, some aren't. And our interpretations of cause and effect, by the way, are not always right. So I think what we really need to begin doing is, focusing there. But I think nonprofits, my concern is that if nonprofits don't begin to own the space of creating metrics that they're gathering and data that they're gathering, and I'm not just talking quantitative, I'm also qualitative, but you do have to have some numbers, and quantitative does help really look at and tease out some cause and effect stuff. And by the way, there's not a lot you can't measure that way, no matter what anybody says. There's ways to do it. But what you need to do is be able to really begin to make those connections and really own it. Because my fear in the nonprofit sector is that a lot of the community impact discussion isn't like the discussion that's happening here. And there are movements out there that are going into looking at not the nonprofit sector in the kind of investment model and asking the community impact outcome questions. And there will be forces driving nonprofits to have to be participants and not own it. And I think if nonprofits don't start empowering themselves to own the metric development and be it objective, getting data from those you serve, somebody else is going to come along and they may be asking a very different question. And believe me, if you follow the Times or the Wall Street Journal, there's some interesting stuff out there talking about others getting involved and investing in this sector and very frustrated by the lack of data and information. And if we don't own it as a nonprofit, I think we're going to have to sort of pay some consequences down the road.
Gordon, I'd like to answer that question because I really agree with Marilyn and Peter. I think, first of all, I'm not sure who asked that question, but there was an assumption that you're not looking at the end user. We are. At the Federation we do. If it's something that's a community-rooted program, the assessment is specifically for that parent or that child. If it's something that's assisting a nonprofit, then we're looking at what the leadership, the executive, the staff, whoever it is, says about what service or program we gave them. But there's a big little exclamation point there. You better fund it then. Because I've got to know, and someone's got to talk to me and work with me on the right questions I have to ask, whether I'm measuring attitudes or shifts in behavior or whatever it is. So you've got to measure it, and it's got to be pre, and it's got to be during, and it's got to be post. And that costs money because somebody's got to write them, somebody's got to administer them, somebody prints them, and someone evaluates them. And it's all very good, but it adds on to the bottom line. And most groups, and I don't care how large they are, really don't have huge budgets to put into that for every program that they have. But everyone wants to know what the end user thinks. No one would walk away from that.
Last question. Let's move from service outcomes to the public policy arena. How do funders, and this is what Garrett was getting at, how do funders measure incremental progress in changing public policy? What are or what should be the metrics? And I'll turn to any one of my colleagues.
This is interesting because I'm actually now part of a larger national group. There's a small group of funders who've formed a group, and they've brought in some consultants who are working in this question of how do we evaluate policy advocacy work. And we're doing some work with California Endowment, Atlantic Philanthropy, so we're sort of taking a look at this. And I think the real challenge is the policy win. There's just, as in a lot of the nonprofit sector, there's just so many variables there, and it's very difficult. And so if you're going to gauge impact at the policy win level, I think where the movement and measurement is going is still yet to be determined, but at the same time, I think there's some movement to begin to look at again when we look at who we are trying to change. And if we begin to break down policy advocacy work and really ask the question at the immediate effect level, who are we changing? What ends up happening is very interesting in the policy advocacy world, where what you're actually doing is trying to change some group, whether it's the public or legislators or others, but those are individuals too, and there's a way to begin to measure progress around just shifts in attitude, shifts in thinking, what kind of information they're bringing to others. So you begin to, I think, unpack in policy advocacy world all those target audiences you have to change, measuring that change that gets you to the policy win, and acknowledge that there are a huge number of other forces and factors out there that are going to impact whether we get that policy win. One great example is an election. So when it really comes down to it, it's beginning to look at unpacking how do we measure the more direct effect, again, of what we're doing. So we're not just focusing on promising the win.
It's tough stuff and contradictory sometimes. Sometimes you think you have an impact, and the result of it is not what you thought it would be. For example, I think some years ago, housing organizations in New York City were very smart and very strong to point out that because the city's economy was better, there was no longer very much city-owned land, no longer very much foreclosure taking place, and these housing groups wanted to be able to continue to build affordable housing, and so advocated for a fund, an opportunity fund that they could access to be able to do deals and go on with their work. The response of both government and, frankly, foundations was to create a fund that so far has been largely unusable for a whole host of reasons. And when you talk to housing advocates, I think the lesson in something like that is you have to keep working at it, because it's not the announcement, the press conference, and say, look what we've done. If you don't keep working at the less glamorous implementation that takes place after you've achieved your sort of policy initiative, I think then we're not talking about a true success. And so, to me, I judge nonprofits not only on their good voice and being able to be heard, but it's also their ability to continue to follow through to make sure that what they think they've won actually means something.
What if your public policy or your advocacy work is focused on continuously just leveling the playing field, which is what we find at the Hispanic Federation, that we engage in a multitude of issues, and we just want to have a voice, a constant voice around housing or hunger or HIV/AIDS or health issues or education issues, and there's not always a measurable outcome. You just want to have a voice and a presence. Or if your advocacy work, as we were very aggressive last year around the comprehensive immigration bill, was to kill the bill. Sad but true, because we thought it was a very, very bad bill. I guess I should have just reincarnated myself into Marilyn's body today, because I just have to say it's continuous. And if you're funding it, you just have to keep looking at the group and really look at the small impacts. I fear using the word modest because I don't like modest in association with my work, but just looking at that continuously. It's going to be, look, that's the other thing. The metrics are going to be different all the time. Sometimes it's going to be huge. You know, we pushed and we got this legislation through that, now, the governor is going to give, health insurance to all kids, and sometimes it's something very, very modest. It's really about, if we think about it, what we should look at is, again, are we funding core elements of what we know is good advocacy work? That's what we need to look at. Let's not look at the outcomes, but let's see, are we building things that are sustainable? And that's, I think, how we should measure impact in terms of public policy and advocacy.
So now that we've dissected what can we learn about our impact, in about 10 minutes we're going to be coming back and what next, planning for future impact. And I know you join me in thanking Marilyn, Lillian, and Peter. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Fred Fields. I'm with United Way of New York City, and I direct the team at United Way that is charged with strengthening New York City nonprofits. Great pleasure to be co-sponsoring the symposium today with New York Community Trust. We wanted to start off by a little audience participation exercise, which is to ask a few questions about where are you guys from? In other words, it's a raised hand response. The idea is just to help get a sense of who is in the room, and so that we can all see that. So we just wanted to start off by doing that before we introduce the second panel. Funders.
That's a lot of funders.
Those who seek funding. United Way is neither fish nor fowl, as Gordon says. We make grants, but we also have many generous donors to help us do that. I should have split that out. Corporate foundations. Our sole representative from the corporate foundation world, we welcome you. Another split out, independent or family foundations. Okay, and finally, I guess this one is sort of grant seekers, but we'll ask it anyway. Service providers. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. I was asked to do that. The moderator for the second panel is Maria Matola, the executive director of the New York Foundation. She is well known, I think, to many of us, and to others perhaps less so. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Maria. But first I wanted to say, one of the topics that we're looking at today, and the keynote speech was on, was really about sustainability. That is to say, how to make things last and have an impact over time. So it's interesting and I think appropriate, given that that's one of the topics, to note that the New York Foundation itself has existed for 99 years and was one of the first of the half dozen charitable foundations founded in this country. So I assume, Maria, there's going to be a large 100th birthday party next year, and that will all be invited? Wonderful. Thank you. Just wanted to clear that up. In 2006, the year for which the last annual report is available, the New York Foundation made grants totaling $4.5 million. And grants are primarily directed to groups in New York City that are community organizers and advocates around issues of urgent concern to residents of disadvantaged neighborhoods and communities. The foundation puts an emphasis on making startup grants to new and untested programs that have few other sources of support. On a personal note, I appreciate the work of Maria's colleague Kevin Ryan, who's a program officer and a colleague of mine in the field of capacity building. Maria joined the New York Foundation in 1994 as a program officer. And prior to that, she was founding executive director of the citywide task force on Housing Court, which, as many of you know, is a housing advocacy organization that promotes the reform, continued reform of New York City's housing court. From 84 to 89, Maria was director of neighborhood programs and a community organizer at Lenox Hill Neighborhood Houses, a settlement house on the east side of Manhattan, and has also taught community organizing at the NYU School of Social Work, and since 1996 has been an adjunct professor at Hunter College, Graduate School of Urban Affairs and Planning. So if anyone from Baruch and the School of Public Affairs is here, now's your chance. From 2003 to 2006, she served as co-chair of the Neighborhood Funders Group, and finally she received her undergraduate degree in liberal arts from the University of Toronto and has a master's degree in social work from Fordham University. So Maria, thank you very much for taking time today to moderate today's second panel, What's Next? Planning for Future Impact.
Thank you. So poor Luana and Melissa, who helped plan this event, had to endure a couple of conversations with me where I was really struggling with trying to figure out what our panel was meant to cover so as not to duplicate the first panel or the keynote speech, and I was really having a hard time understanding exactly what the frame should be. And I had an insight last night that really the key, I think, for our panel is we are the panel of the future. So if the first panel was really looking at where we're at now. Our panel is really supposed to focus on where we're going. And so it made me think about the other night at dinner, I was trying to explain to my 14-year-old son the basic premise of the show Star Trek. And I'm not 99 years old, but I'm pretty old. And trying to explain to somebody in 2008 what the premise of that show was quite ridiculous. But it actually gave me an interesting lens to look at the panel, because I was thinking, I had been saying to him that really Star Trek was about these explorers who were in the future and going from galaxy to galaxy, and oddly enough finding they were meeting people and encountering situations that were strangely familiar to them. And in thinking about introducing the panelists we have, really Star Trek is not a bad frame to use, because each of the folks that are here this morning represent different members of the crew of Star Trek. Because I think when you think about the plot of Star Trek, and some of you may have picked up that I was a huge fan, they were often in situations where they had to quickly evaluate the crisis before them. And so in thinking about introducing our panelists, I thought they have very long bios, and we could take about 20 minutes to do that. But I think probably for your purposes, in addition to knowing where they work and what their experience is, what role do they play in looking at this topic of evaluation? So Barbara, who is with us from Community Resource Exchange, is really Scotty, because her job at Community Resource Exchange, or the role of an organization like Community Resource Exchange and some of the other intermediaries who are here, really is like an engineer. Scotty is the guy on Star Trek that people went to and said, "Why is this happening? Fix it for us." And Scotty, I'm not going to try to do an impression, but was the person who was constantly trying to explain the mechanics of why we were in this predicament in the first place. Jack Krauskopf, who is with us here from Baruch and is a distinguished lecturer and the director of the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management, he really played a role in our calls to plan this that was much like Mr. Spock. The rest of us were asking very sort of emotionally charged, what do you really want us to do, questions, and Jack was very academic and scientific, which is his role, and we're glad that he's on the panel. Carolyn, I think of as Captain Kirk, because in her organization, Carolyn's job is to sit in a big chair, presumably not in a big office, although I'm sure she has lots of people running around giving her, information she has to deal with and questions and, oh my gosh, we're going to crash into that planet kinds of things. And Carolyn really is the person in the Citizens Advice Bureau who really needs to keep her, it's great because Captain Kirk was always looking out that window, right? She always has to keep her eye on what's going to be happening next, where are they going, and making sure that her team is all doing their jobs to make sure that the Starship Enterprise makes it back home to wherever home was, which they never really explained. So you can read their bios. They're wonderful. If any of you watched the Academy Awards the other night, you saw Daniel Day-Lewis sort of bow down to Helen Mirren. And I think for me, I feel like I should bow down to these guys because each person in their own way, particularly Barbara and Carolyn, who I've known for a long time, are people that taught me everything that I know about evaluation, the pros, the cons, the challenges. And I think as a person who works at a foundation, I have to say that our own approach to evaluation, which may come up later, has really been shaped by conversations I've had with both Carolyn and Barbara. So I bow down to you. And we're going to start with some questions that hopefully really do address, in all seriousness, where do we go with all the information that we've gotten today? Gara had lots of great things to say, and so did the speakers on the second panel. But one question that Gara brought up that I want to start with is he really talked about how organizations have to change their course, that sometimes you really can't anticipate what are some of the things that are going to affect your work, and particularly when you're doing work in New York City where communities change, issues change, the constituents you work with, their concerns change. How do you build that into your decisions about evaluating your impact? So Carolyn, I wanted to just start with you to talk a little bit about, even if you'd give us an example of where your organization has had to change course because of things that you didn't or couldn't have anticipated might occur in your community.
So I wasn't anticipating that question, but having Maria and Jack on the panel, I mean, this goes back a number of years, but thinking about sort of our relationships over the years, I mean, one thing that we did very consciously change course on was we had for many, many years been a primary agency doing a lot of welfare advocacy. We did a lot of that when Jack was HRA commissioner and when early years when New York Foundation was funding us. And when welfare reform was passed, you know, it was very clear that, to me, that was going to change. And we consciously moved at that point into workforce development and starting to help people of the South Bronx, you know, enter the workforce. And we did that we now have an office called Bronx Works. It's an employment office. And we also set up a family child care network that would help people have child care available, but also let the women that were the providers, you know, have incomes. So that was one area where we, you know, very consciously changed. The Bronx Works, you know, when you think about evaluation, when you're doing employment work, we're a settlement house, and we have many, many different areas that we provide service in, programs in, and it complicates this whole evaluation very much because you're not just focusing on one area, but they're different across, you know, the different programs. So we have employment. We do a lot of work with homeless people in the Bronx. We have after-school programs. We have early childhood. We have AIDS. We have immigration. You know, it's a very wide range. In terms of like employment, it's pretty. I mean, that's a field where it's pretty well established. Job placements, maybe a profile of who you were placing in jobs. You know, were they long-term unemployed? A lot of ours are welfare recipients and immigrants, you know, two populations considered hard to place, and then retention measurements. And that's something that's pretty, you know, clear, well documented that you can get your arms around. Other areas like, and this was referenced before, you know, children's programs, for example, can be much harder. And you know, whether or not there's even a consensus in the field about what you measure in children's programs. You know, is it, some people say it should be children's educational gains, and other people say, no, that's the school. How can, you know, after-school programs possibly take that on? So one, you know, somebody else might say it's literacy, you know, more general literacy, but not necessarily test scores. Somebody else might say it's the enrichment programs. The kids can't get in school anymore, you know, or less likely to get in school because of cutbacks in school and the focus on the test. So it's music and art. And, you know, part of the problem then with running programs like that is that you get, you have your program and then you need to supplement that in an area like after-school programs where the grants tend not to be particularly large with 2 or 3 funders, and they may all have slightly different emphasis. So, you know, you may have what you want to do, but then, you know, as Gary was saying, you have to sort of fit into the funders.
Right. So, I mean, in terms of community changes, I mean, we certainly see this with our grantees where if you look at our grants list from one year and then you look at it 5 years out, you see how the grantees have had to shift their focus or shift their efforts based on things happening that are changes. But I guess I want to ask Jack and Barbara to sort of weigh in on how do you see those changes coming, and how do you make sure you build in evaluation tools that are going to take into account things that are happening that you can't always anticipate? Jack, do you want to start?
Okay. Not being a Trekkie, I should confess that I'm not sure I'm going to play my role appropriately. I need different ears, though, right, to do this job. Yeah. Well, let me see if I can answer the question by picking up the advocacy point that was mentioned in previous panels and by Gara, because I think to some extent there's a need for some advocacy around what gets measured, and advocacy both with private funders and certainly with government, and I look forward to getting to talk a little more later about what government's doing with some of its performance measurement. But I think what's important here with organizations is that they're very different styles of advocacy depending on what organizations do. And to oversimplify things, there's some organizations that are pure advocacy, and they set out their mission without getting any government support. They keep themselves pure and distinct in a sense. I saw Gail Nailwith around here somewhere before, ran Citizens Committee for Children for 17 years, and I don't think they ever took a dime of government money and were in a position to advocate very broadly for children's issues. Another kind of advocacy is the kind that Carolyn can do, which is perhaps has to be a little more careful because she does get government funding, and you can only bite the hand that feeds you so deeply before you cut off your money. This analogy is not going to go too far. But there's a legitimacy that comes with being a service provider when you advocate, because you're advocating based on knowing what happens in the community. What Peter York was saying, you know what happens in the interaction between your workers and the clients, and you know the impact in a very intimate way, and that's a very important kind of advocacy. So I guess looking forward to the issue of changes that are going to come, it's important that the different advocacy groups determine how they can impact where public policy goes, where the measurement process goes based on their perspectives, their different perspectives. And I think that I can't be very specific about how that might play out, but I think those strategies are worth thinking about in a kind of differentiated way.
Barbara, how can you see change coming?
Let me just take a very broad response to the question. Is this close enough? Can you hear me? People tell me I don't have a loud voice. So I want to talk about excellence. I like having that conversation. It feels better than accountability. But you can tell me later if it has anything to do with accountability, which is how to create excellence in nonprofits and how to make it visible to the outside. We have a lot of clients. I wear a research hat sometimes, and then I work on the ground with many of the organizations, actually in the room today, some of the organizations. So I sort of have these two different perspectives. A lot of our clients achieve excellence in many different areas. They really know their community. Others are very skilled at developing their staff. Some are very talented at advocacy work. So there's areas of excellence that we see. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. You know, they survive. Many of them have been around for many years. But there's a couple of areas where they get stuck. We just see this over and over and over again with the groups that we work with, that there's some holes in their management capabilities that undermines or gets in the way of them being as excellent as they could be. So we want to focus on three specific things. One is, do they know about the high-quality research that already exists in their program areas? Most of our organizations don't. They just don't. So a lot of the answers, the first panel discusses with that, but we're trying to get to solutions. So I think having access and understanding the high-quality research that does exist in many program areas is a very important starting point. Secondly, do they have information systems? Do they have a database that can give them reports that they can actually use? Most of our clients don't. How many of you have a ton of data in your organizations? You have lots and lots of information. Is it sitting in paper files? Is it in an Excel file? It's probably sitting in an Excel file somewhere. It may be in an Access database with some reports that are no longer relevant to what you're doing. But that's the state of the field. We're sort of hampered so much by the lack of a decent information system application that suits our needs, that we have tons of data and we can't make any sense out of it, so therefore we never share it with our staff. We don't even share it with our management team. A lot of executive directors don't on a regular basis even say, okay, so once a month let's look at how we're doing. They don't even do that because they really don't have that kind of internal reporting that you would expect to have. So if you knew about the research in your field and you had really good data that was tracking useful things to you, and you had access to it, the third thing that we have to help groups work on, the other part of this void, is then learning as an organization how to use data. And that's the biggest hurdle. I mean, even if we could solve the first two, which are not small, the bigger hurdle is how do we help our staff, our supervisors, frontline managers, and even senior managers really become what we were calling a data-driven organization. So we're developing a practice area in CRE called data-driven management, because for the first time we're very excited that there's some answers out there, and they haven't been there in the past. So this isn't the fact that our groups don't have a lot of these capabilities isn't their fault. There simply haven't been a lot of answers out there. And what I think the biggest stumbling block has been the lack of information systems. So we're very excited that we're seeing a sea change. In the last couple of years, I think if you talk to NPower, they would tell you the same thing, that they're seeing a huge demand now for organizations wanting to implement some applications that have become affordable. First of all, they're flexible, they're well-developed, generic applications that can deal with some of that program outcome information that's out there. I'm not going to do a plug for specific packages, but there's a couple of things out there. And they're reasonably priced for $10,000, $20,000. An organization can have a customized application, and it can be up and running in a month or two, as opposed to what we used to do, which is spend 3 years developing the specs, having somebody program a customized database, and by the time it was working, your world has changed. So that deals with change. So we think that this data-driven management practice is going to be very important. And I just want to say one more thing, which is that excellence isn't just about data-driven. It's a piece of it, but we know that that then leads groups to be better at performance management, to be better at communicating internally, being clear about their goals, being more effective at at setting and sticking to priorities. There's a whole range of things that groups will become better at because they now have access to information. And the final thing is that I think it will begin to level the playing field. I think up until now, the external perception of excellence has been largely weighted to larger groups because they've had some of these businessy kind of things in place. And I think if we can bring this down to the level of small groups who can have databases and reports and have access to this, that it will level the playing field and that funders will be encouraged to support community-based organizations where maybe they have been feeling that they didn't know who to support in the past. I think this will do a lot to help make excellence much more transparent to the outside.
So I have two questions to follow up related to this. One is, it came up from Jack. To whom are you accountable to, and how do you deal with the fact that your government funding sources and your foundation funding sources and now individual donors may want to hold your organization accountable in totally different ways, and so the data needs to be processed differently or articulated differently for each of those. And the second part of the question is, how do you get staff buy-in? I mean, how do you involve staff in, uniting around this idea of trying to describe what they do in a way that can be talked about more broadly? Carolyn, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, with the data, I mean, and I think this was alluded to before, I mean, part of it is that there are a lot of databases, and we have probably 8 or 10 at least different ones at CAB that the funders want, install or want us to use. And I know this is talked a lot about in the city, and they're all different from each other.
And I just want to clarify, when you say funders, is that a mix of government and private?
No, I think when it's a data system, except maybe with the example before from Carrera with Robin Hood, I think it's all been government.
Okay.
And So they're all these they're quite different from each other. And staff spend a lot of time inputting data. And sometimes you have to hire a whole nother administrative assistant just to input data. So there are all these different systems. And it's very much, I think, one of the points Barbara was making, is that I think the tendency is staff do it because they have to do it. And then what a lot of times happens, you get back reports later from the government agency, if it's government, sort of telling you how you're doing, either whether it's for payments, on a performance-based contract, or more and more, people are rating you. You get back a chart showing how you're doing and the other groups that are funded in that category in comparison. And, I think that's fine. I think what's very hard is to get the agency so that you can proactively use that data yourself. And I think that's really hard.
Right.
I think that a lot of staff and even program directors don't have that level of sophistication to do it. So for an agency like ours, and one of the things we've been talking about, do we try to raise up the computer skills and sophistication of many, many program directors or department directors in order to do that? Or do we think about adding in a new administrative position across the agency that could look, at many, many of these? And then how do you fund that? So, and then just, some of the problems with this. We had one example where we had a funder who had 3 different computer systems within 6 months. And one of them had 2 different versions. And the data was not the same, what you put into each of those. So, the staff just it gets feeling extremely burdensome to the staff. So things, part of the way we track data, and all of our programs generate data, and they do it through monthly reports that goes up through the hierarchy of the agency. And a lot of it is, in reality, and would be better if it wasn't, is measuring against contractual obligations, rather than, us being able to really set our own goals. Which we try to do, but it's so much, driven by the funders. So, we look at that organizationally every month and try to track where we are, and then we also do that, with the fiscal part of the agency. But it's not, we don't have one uniform database. I know some groups here, multi-service agencies, are exploring doing one uniform database. We're not that brave. I don't want to be one of the first 1 or 2 or 3 that go out and do it, because you want to get the benefits from others. We did go in early with one of the package softwares. We paid a lot of money for it. We had to pay to get it customized, and it turned out not to be as useful as we thought it was going to be, and we had this ongoing yearly, significant cost to it, so we started pulling back, decided not to do it, and then found out that some other groups are using it. Now we're sort of hedging back into using this one again, at least for the programs that it is adapted for. So it's challenging. And then just one other thing I'd say, we've just are sort of in the final stage of finishing a strategic plan. So part of what we want to do, which we haven't gotten very far with yet, is to look at a lot of these. With us, and I think with other agencies, the focus of the strategic plan is on your own infrastructure. How can you support the growth that you've had and growth that you might have going forward, and your infrastructure. So then how do you get measurements on the infrastructure, not just on the programs, but, like if you invest more in technology, well, what would be outcomes, and was that worth it, and how would you measure that, or human resources, or training. So one of the things we want to do is emphasize more training on line supervisors. Well, is there a way of measuring whether or not that's, that pays for it, that's worth it, and would it be staff turnover? I don't know how you'd measure sort of quality of supervision. So there's a lot of sort of dilemmas.
So I guess I wanted to go back a little bit to something I think Jack was alluding to, which is, maybe a little provocative. I know Peter kept saying we don't want to be provocative, but anybody who knows the New York Foundation knows we like to be provocative. The question of who gets to shape the discourse around what's being evaluated. I think Gara said that foundations are very pluralistic, and that's very true. It's a very difficult field, even though I've been in it now for 13 years, to really get your arms around, because every foundation is very different, and it sounds like, based on what you guys are saying, every government agency is asking you for something very different. But you are more like one another than foundations are like each other. And I'm wondering how different nonprofits work together to try to educate donors and foundations about how they want their work to be measured. In other words, and getting to Jack's point, what kinds of efforts might there be going forward to educate different government agencies about this is how you should be looking at youth development, or this is how you should be holding us accountable for how we're serving communities around affordable housing. So it's just wondering, what are some of those opportunities going forward, if any?
Well, I think that's just the right question, actually, especially broadening it to include government agencies as well as foundations, because we clearly are at a point, and we're looking here into the future, we're at a point now where performance measurement is a part of the life of any nonprofit that has a government contract, and probably most of those that have just private funding as well. So it isn't as if you can say, well, we have to step back from that. We're in it. It's probably a good thing we're in it. As a general point, we did a survey at Baruch last spring of executive directors of human service agencies in the city. It's an annual survey we do, and we asked, what did they think, people like Carolyn, what did they think about performance measurement in their contracts? And they said, good thing generally. And then once you get below that, you hear a lot of the problems that come out: burdensome, costly, all risk, no reward for performance, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots to be perfected in this system, and I think it's something that organizations need to take on as an important collective advocacy enterprise. And I'm not quite sure what the right form is. There are intermediary organizations in the nonprofit sector. I just mentioned a couple of them that I know pay some attention to this. The Human Services Council certainly looks at contracting issues as an important part of what it does. I know that one of Pat Swan's colleagues at the New York Community Trust is involved with workforce development organizations that are trying to define outcomes there. There was a conference in this room a month or two ago about defining outcomes in the after-school field. So everybody's addressing this and looking at it, and I think it's a work in progress, and it's one that should be high up on people's priority list, because getting it right, not only in what's measured and in having some pushback to government. So, and I'm not saying government is either wrong or evil here. I think government is right in pushing for performance measurement, but having somebody that government is going to be negotiating with to determine what are the indicators is very important, so that the nonprofits play a role in defining what they're being measured on, which isn't always the case right now. Very often you're going to receive a contract and it's going to spell out what the milestones are, not only for your reporting, but also in some cases for how you get paid, because the payment is based on meeting certain targets of employment or placement out of homeless shelters into regular housing and so on and so forth. But beyond what the indicators are, which is an obvious thing that's got to be focused on, it's also the process that's very important. Because right now the process is one that's a tough one for the nonprofits, especially organizations that have multiple contracts with different private funders and city agencies, because you're responding to so many different systems and so many different measures. And I'm not saying you'll ever get to an ideal world where things are uniform, but raising the question of feasibility and what the impact of the performance measurement process is on agencies and on their ability to deliver services, I think is very important, and something to get high on the agenda for funders and for government agencies.
Yeah, and I think it also should be said, I don't know how many funders are left in the room, but Yvonne and I were just talking, funders themselves do evaluations of programs and don't necessarily make them available to the public. They're very internal documents, and I think Gara talked a little bit about why that might sometimes be the case, but I think certainly foundations, we could do a better job in making public some of the ways in which we're measuring and evaluating our programs. So, Barbara, do you want to add anything to that about this question of how organizations that you work with have developed some common language or common ways of measuring their work?
I think that there's a particular challenge with the multiple funder required databases. What I had been describing was, let's pretend you had your own database for your own internal purposes, which is about learning. That's what I was trying to describe. The question is there a connection between these two things? I think the technology is there that you can have your database and out of that export your attendance data and your metrics, even if some of them are funder defined, into the funder system if the funder systems would allow you to import data, as opposed to sitting down looking up each participant one at a time and then entering the attendance. So that's the problem, is you have that. Once you've captured it once, if it were in your own internal system, there's not a technological problem with being able to export data sets to funder-based systems. There's a political problem. The technology, it wouldn't take long for somebody to develop interfaces for each and every one of those data. They're only databases, and they all export and import Excel files. So this could be solved, and you could be collecting your own data, attendance, activities, whatever it is, and then somebody sort of magically ends up in the funder databases. So I don't know, that's my solution to the problem.
So one thing, here's some of the questions. One thing we haven't really addressed is, obviously we're at a convening that was organized by the Better Business Bureau. And so the nonprofit arm of the Better Business Bureau has the New York Philanthropic Advisory Service and this rating system that they use. And so the question is, how does that rating system, if at all, affect the way you look at evaluation, and will it change the way you look at evaluation or going forward, or maybe in Barbara and Jack's case for some of the groups you work with? And I think this is a rating system, if I'm not mistaken, geared more toward individual donors. Am I right? Folks from Better Business Bureau that's here? In other words, if I'm an individual donor, I might look at the rating system as a way of deciding whether or not to make an individual donation to your organization. Has that changed the way you guys look at evaluation at all?
I mean, if I'm remembering it, it's not been a hard standard to meet, so that it's not. I mean, there are reasonable guidelines that aren't particularly hard to meet. I think when you get into broader standards and evaluation, it turns. I think the Better Business Bureau. I'm trying to remember when we did ours. I don't think it's.
Yeah, Jack.
Just two quick comments on that. One is just to underline what's in the package, which is a paper Professor Fred Lane and Greg Chen, our colleague at Baruch, did on whether the standards relate to fundraising outcomes for nonprofits, and the result of the finding in the paper is that they do. That is, those organizations that do better on the Better Business Bureau standards also seem to do better on their fundraising, which is good news. Just a caveat, though, is all the things that we've just been talking about in measurement and performance and so on require administrative people and require infrastructure. And so I would just issue a caution about having some kinds of absolute standards for the amount of administrative support that nonprofits need. Organizations need to build infrastructure. Probably nonprofits are less infrastructured than they need to be to operate in this world we're in right now, and I hope that that'll be recognized by the standards makers.
So just another question from the audience. We know that some foundations, Edna McConnell Clark was mentioned earlier, and Robin Hood, have these models of working with organizations that involve, a higher level of grant and more of, what would we think of, I think, as a more full part. They want to play a partner role in the organization. And so one of the questions is, how does that model of support, which requires a lot of evaluation up front, impact the way we view success in the future? And so, Carolyn, I know you and I have talked a little bit about this over the years.
We haven't had the Edna McConnell Clark monies for years, but in terms of the Robin Hood, I mean, that model of when the funder brings in an evaluation group, pays for it, and then shares the results, I think, from my point of view, that works out. That works out fine, because the staff provide the data, but you're not trying to manage that whole process. So we've had Robin Hood doing that in a few of our programs, and I think it's good. And then there's this other program with Robin Hood, the Single Stop, where they don't put in an evaluation team, but they look at the amount of monies that you're bringing into the people, your clients, the people that have used the program, and use that as a measure of how successful it is. And I think that's fine too. It's been a challenge for us to get all that data, but I think that's reasonable and fair. Now, that may not be all your question, Maria.
No, that's okay. Do you want to jump in, Barb, about what are some of the pros and cons you've seen in your client base around that kind of partnership?
It's sort of hard to know where to start. I think that there's a general problem, and we heard it in the first panel, that we're just sort of all over the place in terms of talking about what's the value of evaluation, what are good indicators. So I think it would be helpful to frame it. And I started to write a paper 5 years ago, and I put it to the side, which was sort of addressing this issue, and maybe it's about time I kind of finished it. Because it's hard to describe. It really makes more sense if you can read it. But some kind of abstract, conceptualization that says okay, let me just try and describe it through stories. If you get data on your program, what is it that you can tell from the data you collect about your program? Maybe you can tell that on Tuesday, kids aren't showing up at the same level they are on Wednesdays. So that leads you to say, so what's going on Tuesdays? And that's a very useful thing to do. You might see that over time, attendance has gone down. I mean, there's some interesting things that you can tell and act on from your own data. But there's a real limit. You can't tell. I heard a story the other day, an after-school program that results were going down over time in terms of what they call the student engagement and learning, which is the key indicator that you should be looking at as a short-term, intermediate-term measure of the effectiveness of your programs is engagement and learning. And you wouldn't know that unless you knew about the research. So if you didn't know about the research, you might be saying, well, how are my test scores doing? And that would be sort of irrelevant. But if you knew to look at engagement and learning and you say, gee, something's happening, it's not going well. We know one of the drivers from the research tells us that an important driver is the level of staff training. So we know that. And the quality of the kind of staff training. So this one program saw that things were going down. They could not have figured out themselves what the answer to their problem was. It was only because they were in a cohort where they were being compared against other after-school programs that they could see that there was an answer out there. You can't learn enough from just looking at your own data. So it was because they could look across programs and the evaluators were working with many different agencies, they could say, well, it seems that when the training is performed by an educator, somebody with a background in education, it works much better. How would you ever have known that? If you just knew that your training sort of wasn't taking hold, how would you discover that that was an answer for you? You wouldn't have. So there's a lot of that. There's many more examples of when the real important lessons, many of them are done through these large sample comparative studies that are longitudinal and have control groups, and that is so important to the field. And yes, you can collect your own data and learn nuances about how well you're implementing and what's happening and whether kids are showing up or not, but that's small stuff. A lot of the big stuff you will never be able to learn from looking at your own data.
And I think that gets back to the point you made earlier where that understanding that there is quality research out there about some of the areas in which you're doing your work, and trying to make sure that that's available and that people find it. So another question from the audience is that we haven't talked about yet is what role the board plays in really helping to shape the way your program looks at itself and evaluates itself and measures whether or not it's having impact. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Our board has been pushing us on that, and I think it's been very positive. It's been around the program areas, but really trying to have us set goals that are beyond the contractual goals, and in broader program areas, we tend to look, because of the nature of the funding, at the unit that's being funded, and we've been trying to move into sort of broader programmatic areas and set goals and track those. And those we are reporting, we're running the goals, the program committee of the board is approving those, and then we're reporting twice a year against those broad goals. And the senior level, at least of the program staff, have really bought into that process. So I think the board, in our case, is being very helpful in sort of challenging us that way. I think part of what happens is you're very busy and you get sort of assaulted with a lot of different demands, and having something like a meeting at the board that you have to prepare for and you got to get the data for and you got to get it looked at is helpful, because it sets the structure and the framework, beside the good input that the board members can give.
Yeah, and I know we've definitely seen with grantees, particularly startup organizations, that there's a whole degree of helping the board understand their role as both evaluators internally of the work, but also ambassadors for the work, because the better they understand it, the better they'll be at talking about your work out in public and in the world. Barbara and Jack, do you have any thoughts on the board and in terms of your interaction with groups? I know, Barbara, you do a lot of training of boards on some of these issues.
One sort of brief thing. In a perfect world, what I would like to see change in our interactions with boards would be that we don't wait for so many board members ask really good questions that the agency has not thought of, and so they're scrambling to collect the data to answer the board's question, or, oh, we're going into a board meeting, so let's collect our data so that we can answer their questions. My God, why don't we do it for ourselves? Wouldn't it be great if every time a board member asked a great question, you say, yeah, we've thought about that, or we looked at this data ourselves every month as a management team, and we know what we're doing, so that you're prepared. You're not collecting data for the board meeting. You're collecting it for yourselves. And then, you're sharing what you're doing with your board. So anyway, that's my fantasy.
So we got the 2-minute warning. I just wanted to end with one thing, one sort of metaphor that occurred to me, because I think even in thinking about moderating the panel today, I thought, I think having sat on your side of the table, this question of how we talk about our work, how we evaluate it, it's sometimes discussed, I think, as though this is not something that keeps you guys up at night. It certainly keeps you guys up at night. Nobody has to ask you to worry about whether or not you're having impact in your communities. This is what you think about all the time. And it made me think about when I was a kid, and I'm sure this is true for some of you, that thing that would happen sometimes where you'd start to think about breathing and how you breathe, and then you'd be walking down the street and you'll think, how am I breathing? How am I breathing? And then suddenly you actually get so panicked you stop breathing because you're thinking too much about breathing, and then you can't breathe. And I think that's a good analogy, because I think it isn't that we should not think about evaluating our work or whether or not it has impact, but you are thinking about that all the time. Sometimes it's so much a part of what you're worried about every day, it can paralyze you, right, and make you think that it's difficult to ever put words to it. But I appreciate Carolyn and Jack and Barbara sort of helped us put words to it, and that was really great. So somebody did ask the question. I wish I could guess who it was. I'm guessing it was Pat Swan. Who in Star Trek is Maria? So I'm going to answer it seriously, because it's a good question. Who are the funders in that little scenario I described? And to be honest, it's a hard question to answer, but I think the answer is we are the alien planets that you're visiting. Because just like on Star Trek, it's incredibly difficult to anticipate what we look like. It's very unpredictable what's going to happen, right? Remember when they would beam down, you never knew exactly what was going to happen. Were they going to be friendly? Were they going to be hostile? And I think just like on Star Trek, the variety, incredible variety of different kinds of aliens that they met is very similar to the aliens that you meet in the Foundation world. So I think I have to do more thinking about which alien I am in which episode, but that's my answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. And we are the galaxy, right? So I want to thank our distinguished panel, the panel that preceded this one, Gara LaMarche. It's been a terrific morning. I want to thank all of you for being such a tremendous resource for all of us in the galaxy. I want to let all of you know that everything that you've been hearing is going to be available. Talk about sustainability. It's going to be available on our website, bbb.org. Again, just type in your zip code and you'll get to the New York website. And we are preparing a white paper, which all of you will be receiving. Just a quick note on what was brought up before with the BBB standards for those of you who may not know. First of all, we do have information in your packet, but briefly, there are nationally the Wise Giving Alliance standards, which are 20 standards by which we rate charities in terms of their governance, measuring effectiveness, finances, and fundraising and informational materials. So what I often say is that there are a number of organizations which rate charities from a financial perspective. Ours just has a broader scope in terms of how we look at charities. And I will say that the program in New York is the largest in terms of the local charity rating systems around the country. The Wise Giving Alliance looks at the national charities. We look at all charities that solicit funds in New York. There are a few of them through the BBB system around the country. We are the largest. So please do take a look at what we put into your packet, again, from an informational standpoint for some of you and from a possible participation point of view for the rest of you. We urge you to do that. The rest of the day, what's going on? Number one, Julie Flock's session, because I should back up. We are going to have lunch. We will feed you. There is lunch out there from 11:30 until 12. And then at 12 o'clock, promptly, I've been asked to emphasize, the breakouts will begin. And Julie Flock's session on the 990 is right here in this room. And Pat Swan's session on how small nonprofits can demonstrate effectiveness to funders. And Yvonne Moore's session on when measurement is a challenge, tips on evaluating hard to quantify activities. Gee, sounds familiar. That will be in 2 rooms down the hall, across from where you were registered. Let's see if I got everything. Yes, the evaluation forms. We need them. Talk about talking to your users, right? We need those forms, so please fill them out and provide them to us back up front. We actually read them, and we do take what you say into account for the next one, which we definitely will be looking to do. And again, I just want to thank you. This is the last of the general session, so I do want to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of what I know is a crazed schedule to be here this morning. And again, I just want to thank all of our speakers for taking their time, and to all of our supporters, United Way, New York Community Trust, NIREG. Rana, thank you for helping to arrange for our keynote speaker this morning, and to the rest of our partners. So we're not done. Enjoy the rest of your morning, and again, remember to go to that website and use us as a resource for this program. Thank you.
This is the last session of the day. That's always the tough one to be at. It's also tough when it's right after lunch. But I want to welcome you to, at least if nothing else, the topic is exciting because the topic is the redesigned Form 990 and what that means with regard to Sarbanes-Oxley, what that means with regard to governance, and particularly what the impact of what's going on in the commercial sector might have on the not-for-profit sector. And we're going to see, as we talk about some of the aspects of the redesigned 990, again, particularly in the governance area, that there clearly is what we call a cascade effect. I know that the room is awfully spread out, but I would ask, if you do have questions, I'm going to try to make this as interactive as I can. So just raise your hand, and I'll be happy to take your questions. I'll repeat them up here for the benefit of anybody else, and then we'll just try to move along. So that's the next slide. Okay. This is kind of the bulk of where we are today in the commercial world. So we say, what are the key concepts of Sarbanes-Oxley? I know everybody's familiar with the idea of Sarbanes-Oxley. We all know it applies in the commercial world. But really, what does it go to? And the heart of the areas that it's focused on are listed here. But basically, it has to do with the governance that is going on in commercial organizations. And by the way, when I say commercial, I mean public companies, or we call them issuers, as opposed to the rest of the marketplace, which would be non-issuers. So we're in the non-issuer world. At any rate, so Sarbanes-Oxley says, there have been a lot of business failures, there's been a lot of scandal, there's been a lot of things that are happening in organizations that have been bad things. And when we look at what those things are and why those things took place, what we find time and time and time again, different variations of the same theme, which is someplace governance broke down in the organization. Sarbanes-Oxley is an attempt to try to correct that under the thought that a strong organization, a good governed organization, and again, that's a term you're going to hear throughout this whole next hour, a good governed organization is an organization that's far less likely to get into difficulty. So Sarbanes-Oxley says things like, if you have an audit committee, which in the public company world you have to, the audit committee should be comprised of people who understand financial information. I mean, that seems kind of obvious, but they should be financially literate, meaning that when they look at financial statements and they interact with auditors, they should have an understanding of what they're looking at. Conflict of interest. Conflict of interest policies. Gee, if somebody serves at an organization on a board level or even in management level for an organization, but at the same time they have a relationship that could put them in a conflict. They somehow work for another organization that has a related relationship, or they get paid somehow in another capacity from another organization, or somewhere there could be a conflict. Well, then that should be evident to everybody. And that person doesn't make that person bad or unable to serve, but it does mean that that person should recuse him or herself from any decisions that would be deemed to have put them in some ability to be enriched by the decision. Code of ethics. Code of ethics. We should all act honorably. Those are great words. I teach auditing at Baruch. We spend a lot of time in our class talking about what ethics means, what ethics is all about. We like to think ethics are things that we've learned when we were little and we grow up, a moral code, what's right and what's wrong. But an organization should have a formal code that says, here's the things that we believe on all levels, again, board and staff, management, here's the things that we believe, this is the things that we promote in our corporate culture with regard to ethics. Document destruction and retention policies. Why do we talk about document destruction and retention? There should be strong policies in place for an organization as to what records they keep, what records they destroy, and there could be lots of good reasons to destroy records. It's not bad to destroy records, as long as it's done in some sort of very authorized systematic format. And retention as well. What do we keep? How do we keep it? Who makes the decisions to keep these policies, these documents? Who makes the decisions to destroy these documents? So there should be policies in place for that. Whistleblowers, we've seen that time and time again in the marketplace. We read stories about this whistleblower or that whistleblower came forward and a fraud was uncovered in an organization. One of the statistics that's out there about whistleblowers is far and away the most prevalent way of finding wrongdoings in an organization is by whistleblowers. It's not by auditors. It's not by government investigations, the IRS or any New York State or anybody else. It's by whistleblowers. So these whistleblower provisions are really important, and we'll spend some time talking about that as well. Independent board members. So we all know what board members are. An independent board member is somebody who gets no other remuneration from the organization, other than perhaps as a class of people who are served by that organization. But in other words, they're not compensated in any capacity. Why is that important? Well, the idea there is if they stand to gain nothing, one way or another, from the organization, then they're going to act in the best interests of the organization, not going to affect them personally. Compliance with regulators, I mean, that seems pretty obvious. You know, one should comply with regulators. Just seems like you'd get into trouble if you don't. But again, that's one of the provisions. Financial oversight. Boards should exercise, and management should exercise strong financial oversight over the affairs of an organization. And then I left the last one. The last one's probably less applicable to the nonprofit sector, but it's certainly, in terms of regulation, but it's certainly applicable to the for-profit sector, and that has to do with internal controls. We all know internal controls have to do with how information is processed in an organization. Who does what? Are there things like segregation of duty, different people doing different functions? Is there a lot of oversight about how things work in an organization? Is there a lot of separation so that no one person assumes too much responsibility or has too much control, and therefore that's dangerous because that can lead to defalcation concerns or other concerns. So in the commercial world, in the public company world, internal controls have been items that have been focused on by Sarbanes-Oxley, and commercial organizations are now required to undergo audits of their internal controls, such as to be able to certify to the marketplace that their controls are functioning. Again, that's not really relevant to us because that provision has not really bled down to the nonprofit sector. So that's sort of an overview of what Sarbanes in the governance world, anyway, is all about. And with that, I want to direct us right to the Form 990, the redesigned Form 990, and talk about specifically on the form itself where we see what the IRS considers to be important for our sector. And let me make a couple key points about the Form 990. First of all, it's a 2008 form. So that's for calendar year 2008, which means it's filing in 2009. If you're a calendar 2008, you're subject to it. If you're a fiscal year, again, you'll do the math on it, but it's for the 2008 year. It's a core form. I don't know how many people have looked at this form. It's a core 11-page core form and 16 supplemental schedules. It is a complete and total overhaul of what the 990 looked like before. And when the IRS did this, and I don't know, maybe with a show of hands, how many people are at all familiar with this form? How many people have seen it? Okay, great. So when the IRS embarked on this process of redesigning the form, and this goes back, believe it or not, a really long time ago, the IRS recognized that the current Form 990 was really insufficient for everybody's needs. First of all, the Form 990 itself started in 1942. It was 2 pages long, 2 pages. And what has basically happened through the years is as questions or concerns or issues arose in the marketplace that the IRS, or by the way, other interested parties who are concerned about the 990 thought were important, those questions and concerns got plopped onto the form. And because it was kind of even though, we say it's a public forum, the reality is certainly back in the early genesis of those forums, because it was kind of more of a tax form than it was anything else, it really didn't matter all that much where the questions were on the form. What was the big deal? You were just filling out the form and the IRS was using it. But through the years, as it has become increasingly a document that goes way beyond just compliance with the IRS tax code, and goes into things like, state regulators who have concerns with it, marketplace has concerns, donors, grantors, media, so on, and researchers, so on and so forth. The idea that the form has just been this confusing jumble of questions, some of which are repetitive, some of which have contrasting or conflicting definitions, some of which have been asked in different places on the form, has begun to be a real problem. And I don't think there's anybody in the marketplace who would say, wow, I love the old Form 990. I'm really sorry that they decided to change it. So the IRS, again, they embarked on all of this. And their goal, as they went out to do this, was to say we have three main objectives. One, we want to enhance compliance with the tax code. We want to make people do things right. We want to promote accountability and transparency, meaning we recognize that other people use this form beside us, and so we want people who are using this form to be understanding of what organizations are saying on the form. We want to make it more user-friendly, and this is kind of conflicting, and we want to reduce burden, meaning we recognize that the form is very difficult to use, very confusing, and so we want to try to organize it and make it much simpler for people to understand and to use. That was the goal. And you'll see, again, as we go through some of the things on this form, that these three themes, enhancing compliance, promoting accountability and transparency, and decreasing burden, are sprinkled all throughout the form. I don't know, the decreasing burden, 11-page core form and 16 supplemental schedules. I think the jury's a little out on decreasing burden. But at any rate, that's what the goal was. So one point to make really early on, again, a point that the IRS itself has made, and certainly it's been out in the marketplace as well, has been, well, wait a minute. You guys are tax authorities. And basically, your first point, which is talking about enhancing compliance, has to do with compliance with the tax code. That's you, IRS, your tax code. But there are lots and lots and lots of questions on this form that are not driven by the tax code. They're driven by, again, things that are out in the marketplace, things that people might want to know about. Governance, by the way, being one of them. Governance, as we're going to talk about here, most of the themes that are coming through on governance here, those aren't in the tax code. So how can you, the IRS, say that, people have to comply with these governance requirements if in point of fact, or at least disclose all this information about governance when governance, again, isn't a matter of tax code. The IRS's counter to that is the belief, Sarbanes-Oxley driven, or at least in theory, the belief that, well, a better governed organization leads to a better compliant organization, a more ethical, a more accountable, a more transparent organization. And so the IRS has not really backed down in spite of, a fair amount of pressure from the marketplace. The IRS has not backed down at all from their stance that they're going to ask a lot of governance questions on the form. Again, we're going to see those. Now, when this form first came out in draft, one of the criticisms, and this is, by the way, this is the revised form. It came out originally in June in its first incarnation. But when it first came out, one of the big problems with that form, aside from a lot of the questions that people were very unhappy with, was that there was really no room, no place on that form for organizations to be able to say, here's what we do at our organization. There were a lot of yes and no answers with regard to governance and no opportunity to say, well, here's why. Yes, we have a conflict of interest policy. No, we don't have a conflict of interest policy, but here's why. Yes, we have a code of ethics. No, we don't. Here's why. Here's how we govern. Here's what we do. All of those kinds of things. There was no place to do that. And so the IRS, again in this new form, added what we call Supplemental Schedule O, which is a new form, and we call Schedule O is like, oh my goodness, I meant to say this. But Schedule O is the opportunity to be able to elaborate on some of these governance questions. Okay, so a couple things just to note starting on this page 1. We're going to go through the first couple pages fairly quickly till we hit the governance section, and that's the bulk of where we're going to spend our time. But you'll notice in the highlighted information here some of the questions this first page refers to, and the first page is meant to be a snapshot. It's meant to capture the kind of key components. This is what the IRS thinks is the key components that an organization would want to get across to the marketplace about what it is. And so right there in the summary, along with talking about the organization's mission, right there it asks how many voting members do you have on your governing body? How many independent voting members do you have? Total number of employees, and by the way, a new question this year, total number of volunteers, which is kind of an interesting one. Again, when we get to the governance section, this is going to be a little bit more expanded, but clearly, by virtue of putting this on the very first page, the IRS has a firm belief that if somebody's going to look at this organization, one of the most important things that they're going to want to know is how do you govern the organization? How many people vote? How many people that vote are independent? Okay, moving on. Let's move to page 3, next page. Okay, page 3, this page here, is a page that has a checklist of required schedules, and this basically directs the organization to fill out whatever is appropriate of those supplemental 16 schedules. So in other words, if the organization has compensation, it's going to answer questions here and it's going to fill out a compensation form. If it has related relationships, it's going to fill out a related relationship form. If it gets non-cash contributions, it's going to fill out a non-cash contribution form. So this is a checklist that basically just directs the user of this as to what kinds of things the organization is doing. But what I want to highlight here is question 12. And question 12 says, first time this question has been asked, did the organization receive an audited financial statement for the tax year for which it is completing this return that is prepared in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles? Now, that's a brand new question, and it's particularly interesting because federally there is no requirement to have an audited financial statement. In fact, those are state requirements. Various states have different requirements. New York, for instance, has a requirement. You've got revenues above $250,000. You raise money from the public. You're going to need to have an audit. But that's not true in many other states. So it's interesting that here the IRS is asking the question about do you or do you not have an audit. And again, this is an example of when an organization might want to check and define what it does on Schedule O, under the thought of, gee, if you check no, I don't undergo an audit, does that make me seem like a bad organization or a less than compliant organization? But at any rate, again, that's not tax code driven. Organizations are not required to have that on federal tax code. The other two things on this statement, again, just to highlight, was a loan to or by a current or former officer or director, key employee, so on and so forth, outstanding at the end of the tax year, meaning did the organization loan anybody money? And then the second piece, did the organization provide a grant or other assistance to an officer, director, trustee, key employees, et cetera? Okay, so right away, going back to that idea of related relationships, people benefiting by virtue of their position at an organization, personally benefiting. On the next page, and 28 just continues with more questions about, along the same theme, did they have any direct relationship, any direct business relationship, family members, serve in another organization that does business with this organization. Doesn't necessarily, again, make them bad. I could be a board member of two organizations that interrelate, And that doesn't make it bad, but it does mean it's something that the IRS is going to want to know about. Again, Schedule O gives me the opportunity to describe it rather than just checking yes and having no opportunity to tell the marketplace what that means. Right. On the next page, this is IRS filings and tax compliance in other areas. So the IRS wants to know, again, these are kind of new questions. The IRS wants to know, by the way, did you comply with all the payroll tax requirements? Did you comply with independent contractor employee rules and file all requisite 1099s and, those kinds of things? Did you, a bunch of other questions. Did you comply with donor requirements? Donor gave you something. Did you give the receipt back that said thank you for your contribution of X in goods and services or whatever that is? So again, IRS is very interested in knowing whether or not the organization is complying not just specifically with the 990, but whether they're complying with other federal requirements, IRS requirements that the organizations are subject to. Next page. Here we are, governance. Here's where the IRS, and again, this is probably of all of, not probably, definitely, of all of the forms, of all of the pages on this form, this has been far and away the most controversial aspect of the form. This is governance. There's 3 separate sections that the IRS is asking questions regarding governance. The first one has to do with the governing body and management. The second one has to do with the organization's policies around governance. And the third one has to do with the disclosures that the organization is making basically to the public about governance. And here is where, if we want to talk about the crossover to Sarbanes-Oxley or the bleed down or the cascade effect of the things we saw in that first slide, the whistleblower and conflict of interest and code of ethics and all of those independent members of the board and so on and so forth, here's where those policies kind of come to roost right here on this form. And so the IRS is saying here, and again, remembering this is not tax code driven, but the first part, how many voting members are there of the organization? How many voting members are independent? Did any officer, director, trustee have any kind of family relationship or business relationship with any other officer, director? 2 people married, needs to be disclosed. Again, doesn't make it bad, just means that it's got to be disclosed. Did the organization delegate control over management duties customarily performed by or under the direct supervision of officers? So in other words, did it have a management company working for it? Or did it outsource its management functions? That's kind of what that question's going toward. Here is a really interesting question. This is brand new. Did the organization become aware during the year of a material diversion of the organization's assets? That means fraud, for those people who aren't sure what material diversion of assets is. The organization become aware of fraud that took place in its organization. By the way, I don't know what material is going to be defined as. I don't know. We might all have different definitions of whether something is material. But here, if an organization becomes aware that something happened during the course of the year, it now has to not only tell the IRS, in essence, it's telling everybody by answering this question. I sat in on any number of meetings where we talked with the IRS about, when you ask this kind of question and it's a yes-no question, is it better to say yes or is it better to say no? Because, gee, if you say yes, well, maybe that means that the organization actually has good controls. Something went wrong and they found it and they rectified it. And by virtue of checking no, that doesn't mean that there wasn't fraud. It just means it wasn't found. So you're kind of in a quandary here as to when you're answering. I mean, obviously you answer the question truthfully, but when you're trying to figure out, well, what's the right answer? What's the better public perception? Is it yes or no? The reality is, without explaining, yes or no, neither answer is such a great answer. So If you got an organization, that is going to answer this question, our suggestion is Schedule O. Even if you say no, we haven't had any fraud, but you might also want to say, and here's, what we, the organization, do in terms of our own internal controls and reviews and structures and all of that, to hope we never do have any fraud. But anyway, that's a governance question. Did the organizations is another really big one for not-profit organizations, particularly not-profit organizations maybe that are small, that have a number of committees, but the committees themselves, committees of the board, but the committees themselves don't necessarily document their meetings, or the board itself doesn't necessarily document its meetings. Here you have a question that says, did the organization contemporaneously document the meetings held or written actions undertaken during the year by the following: the governing body, each committee with authority to act on behalf of the governing body. Contemporaneously, by the way, everyone knows that means within the later of the next meeting or 60 days after the action is taken. So basically, not that you went back at the end of the year and you said, oh, what did we talk about at the board meetings, and you wrote it all down, but then on an ongoing basis, you've got procedures in place at your organization to track the decisions that are made on the board level, decisions that are made on the committee level. Straight out of Sarbanes-Oxley. I mean, that's just verbatim out of Sarbanes-Oxley. And IRS's position, as was Sarbanes-Oxley's position, is organizations that make very definite decisions and document their decisions and have a course or a plan of action are going to be governed better. And so, here this is out for the marketplace. Again, you're an organization with 3 board members. It starts to be a little ridiculous to have 11 committees. That's just not practical. But I certainly would suggest, when you're looking at this question and answering it on your own organization's 990, that you've got some sort of public relations comment for what you're going to want to say on your Schedule O about what you do with regard to your board minutes and your committee minutes. And perhaps even now's the time, if you don't already document all of that stuff, maybe now's the time to consider putting those policies and procedures in place. Certainly that's, again, what we're telling our clients. Did the organization have local chapters? If it does it have a relationship that's written with policies and procedures around how those local chapters interact with headquarters, a national organization? Again, what are they following? Things like that. Was the copy of the Form 990 provided, this is a big one, provided to the organization's governing body before it was filed? All organizations must describe in Schedule O the process, if any, the organization uses to review the Form 990. I can tell you, I'm an auditor in public practice. I have a lot of clients. I think I have one client where we sit in a board meeting before the 990 gets filed and wait for the board to approve, the entire board to approve the 990 before that's filed. And it is an incredibly painful meeting. I dread it. So here, if you're an organization, as I'm sure virtually everybody in this room is part of, if you're an organization where the governing body is not reviewing the 990 before it's filed, or a committee of the board isn't reviewing it, I suggest you either start thinking about how you're going to answer the question. Again, Schedule O. Here's the process that we have in place for what we do, and we consider it to be sufficient, or perhaps implementing the different policies and procedures around that. But you need to know that that question's there. Why? It goes right back to accountability. Section B on policies. These policies are lifted straight out of Sarbanes-Oxley. Does the organization have a written conflict of interest policy? If yes, are officers, directors, trustees, key employees required to disclose annually interests that could give rise to conflicts? And does the organization regularly monitor and enforce compliance with the policy? If yes, describe. So it's not enough to just say, well, we have a conflict of interest policy. Yeah, when somebody joins the board, when somebody joins management, when somebody joins the organization, We make them sign a form that says either I don't have any conflicts, or if I have any conflicts, I'll say something about the conflicts, or whatever that might be. It's not enough to just do that. Now it's saying, well, what's your process on an ongoing basis? And by the way, again, one of the criticisms of this question was it a good or a bad to have a conflict? Isn't it maybe it's okay if somebody's conflicted if they disclose, hey, yeah, I do serve in other capacities, but here's where those are. Yes, I'm on the board, and yes, we also provide investment services to the organization, but by the way, at no charge or reduced fee or whatever that might be. So I don't vote when it comes time to any investment decisions, or I provide legal services, but I'm not part of the process when people decide whether or not my organization should continue to be providing legal services. All of those kinds of things. Doesn't make those conflicts bad. But the question here is, do you have the policy? If you have the policy, do you follow the policy? And what do you do to follow that policy? How does it work? What kind of procedures do you have in place? Much worse to have a policy that you don't comply with is to not have even had the policy. I mean, that's just downright dangerous. So again, conflict of interest, big hot area from Sarbanes-Oxley. Does the organization have a written whistleblower policy? The IRS, again, recognizing where is fraud likely to be captured. Does this represent kind of good governance in the commercial world? Organizations should have whistleblower policies. And for those people that are not familiar, a whistleblower policy, in essence, gives protection to somebody who comes forward to say, gee, I think that there's something going on in the organization in a financial capacity that might be inappropriate. It gives protection to that person can't automatically be fired, right? And there's these are kinds of policies you wouldn't want to just boilerplate implement. These are kind of policies you would want to work with an attorney pretty carefully about, making sure it's making sense for your organization and things like that. But that's essentially what a whistleblower policy is all about. Does the organization have a written document retention and destruction policy? Again, we talked about that before. But here the IRS wants to know, how are you keeping your records? Who's responsible for how those records are being maintained and how those records are being destroyed? Did the process, here we get into compensation-related questions, and I would say this might be an area where organizations in nonprofit sector, certainly smaller organizations, might have some issues. Did the process for determining compensation of the following persons include a review and approval by independent persons, comparability data, and contemporaneous substantiation of the deliberation and decision for the organization's CEO, executive director, or top management official, other officers, or key employees of the organization? So in other words, what's the process here by which the organization is deciding, yeah, here's the compensation as is being set for the top people who govern the organization. Here's what the compensation level is. Is it being documented? Is it being approved by anybody? And how'd they get those numbers? What kind of work did they do to say, yeah, these are good numbers. This is fair. This is consistent with the marketplace. This is not, above what would be customary and reasonable and things like that. So what are your processes? What's in place to do that? Again, I would say of all of this, probably this might be the area that this and the Form 990 being reviewed by the board, this would probably be the area that organizations are going to really want to look at and figure out what they do in their own organization before they have to file this form. Other questions, again, did the organization participate in joint ventures with related parties or for-profit organizations, taxable entities, and questions along that nature? Does it have a written policy or procedure regarding the organization's evaluation as to whether these relationships are a good idea or not a good idea? What does it do? Disclosures. Third element of governance, disclosures. One, what states is the organization filing in? What is the organization making available to the public? And it lists 1020, the Form 1023, which is the application for exemption if organizations have that. Their 990. Their 990T, if they have a 990T, that has to be made available to the public. And how do you make them available? What do you do? And there's a little check mark for, we put it on our website, we put it on someone else's website, kind of like a guide star, presumably, or we make it available upon request. So the IRS wants to know, how's the organization giving out this information to the public about its filings? Describe and schedule O whether the organization, and if so, how, the organization makes its governing documents, conflict of interest policy, and financial statements available to the public. We're back to financial statements. And by the way, it doesn't say audited financial statements, it says financial statements. So an organization might prepare internal financial statements, organization might have external financial statements. How is it making that information available to the public? And again, you're back to, if you're not making it available to the public, somewhere in Schedule O, you're describing why not. Or you're describing why you don't have financial statements. And then the last piece on this one is, and by the way, what's the physical address of the person and telephone number of the person who's got basically the books and records? In other words, if I want to contact somebody, who is it I contact at that organization? Everyone knows, obviously, this is not only is the organization itself having to make this available, even if they don't, you can go on GuideStar and get this information. You can, by the way, in New York. For anybody who doesn't know, New York's Charities Bureau website now increasingly has the ability, you can go on that website, you can look up an organization, and you can get its filings with its latest 990, you can get its filings with New York, and in some cases that includes its financial statements, its audited financial statements, copies of its extensions. So this information with this person's name and address and contact information is available. An independent board member is a person who receives no benefit from the organization. So in other words, if I'm an employee, if I'm a board member, but I'm the president of the organization and I draw a salary, it doesn't make me a bad person, but it means I'm not independent. Now, the only exception in our world, in the not-profit world, is I might be part of a class of citizens that benefit from what the organization does. You know, the organization provides training. I happen to go to training. I'm also a board member. But that's not considered a conflict for my independence. That's part of a class of citizens. But if in any way, shape, or form I or one of my relatives is providing, and then it defines relatives, you know, spouse or child or things like that, is receiving a benefit of some capacity from that organization, then I'm not independent. Again, I could be providing legal services to the organization at a discounted fee. It could be a great arrangement. All of that's fine, but I'm still not independent. I might be a board member, but I'm not an independent board member. You're providing services to another organization and they happen to be a member, they happen to be a board member of that organization? Yeah, and again, I would say, you know, without knowing the specific circumstances, I would say unless they're personally benefiting, I would maybe not. That's part of the charitable class. Yeah. That's what most of my clients in some capacity have some sort of arrangement like that. Again, my suggestion is what you really want to do there is you want to think about how you're going to answer this question. And whether what you're going to want to do, and that's really for you and your board to make the decision, but you're going to want to either say, okay, we're happy with the policies, and we're happy to say, no, our board does not review this before it's filed, but here on Schedule O, here's what we do. And we're happy with this. Or whether you and your board decide, well, you know what, we'd rather not check no, we'd rather check yes, and so, we're going to go through. Everybody's going to have to make that decision as to what they think is best for their own organization. Yeah. I could just say, just again, this is just my own personal opinion, but my personal opinion is having a board sit around the room, talk about an 11-page core form and a 16-page schedule for, things that they're not, most of them are not really going to understand. I mean, page by page by page. That doesn't sound like a meeting anybody would want to be at, but, be that as it may, that's really what the question's asking. So, okay, other questions around this page? Kelly? Yes. Yes, the question is, can you use the business address here? And the answer is absolutely. Yeah. Well, the thing is, can you run it through a finance committee or an audit committee or something like that? Yeah, but then again, I think you're back on Schedule O to explain that. Yeah, you're back on Schedule O. Right. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Here's what we do. Okay, I only want to just thumb through just a couple other things to highlight here, and then I want to leave maybe 10 minutes for a couple more questions. But if we just go to a couple of the other pages, page 7, we're not going to go through this, but this is really lots and lots of questions about compensation. And there's related schedules for compensation. So organizations, obviously, that pay people, there's going to be whole schedules that they fill out that are going to have to do with not just the compensation that the organization is paying that person, but if that person's getting compensation from other related organizations or benefits from organizations that are related to this organization, all that information is going to need to be disclosed. Let's flip a little bit. Yeah, go again. And one more. There we go. Here, these questions on the bottom, financial statements and reporting. So here, financial statements. Disclose the accounting method used to prepare the Form 990, cash accrual, or other. So for organizations that are used to audited financial statements in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, they're using an accrual basis. Some other organizations might be using another method, but here they've got to tell the public. Were the organization's financial statements compiled or reviewed by an independent accountant? Was the organization's financial statements audited by an independent accountant? Again, we're back to that same question. Is the organization undergoing an audit? If you are, that's a yes. If you're not, that's Schedule O. If yes, does the organization have a committee that assumes responsibility for the oversight of the audit, review, or compilation of the financial statements and selection of the independent accountant? So in other words, here is the question about the audit committee. Again, right out of Sarbanes-Oxley, do you have an audit committee or a committee that is responsible for the audit process, selection of the auditors, among other things? As a result of the federal organizations that receive federal funding, they're now required to disclose here whether or not they're subject to federal requirements, and if they are subject to those requirements, do they undergo the requisite audits required there. So again, the IRS is branching out. A133 audits, compliance audits, those are the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. That's certainly not IRS. But here the IRS is asking whether an organization is complying with states, complying with, in some cases here, gaming authorities, complying with OMB, complying with fundraising requirements and registration forms and all of that. Again, not IRS-driven, other agencies-driven. So clearly lots of questions about compliance with regulations that are not necessarily IRS regulations. Okay, and let's go to the very last piece that I want to mention. Go two more. Next one. There we go. This last section, this is Schedule D off of the form. Schedule D is the supplemental financial information form. We're clearly not going to go through that here. But I do want to mention this last section on the form is basically telling organizations, okay, if you've got a financial statement and you've got a Form 990, the rules for how one fills out a financial statement under GAAP and the rules for how one fills out a tax filing under IRS regulations are not necessarily the same. And as a result of that, you might have revenue shown on one that's not shown as revenue on the other, and you might have expenses shown as one that are not shown as expenses on the other. And what this thing is doing is saying basically reconcile, tell the public how it is that you have the differences between those elements. So how are you reconciling your revenue per audited financial statements to your revenue per your tax filing, and likewise with your expenses? That's essentially what this is doing. And then the supplemental is, again, describe, if there are things to describe, here's the place to do it. This, again, is kind of a big deal. We had this in the old form, but it was in shortened form than what we've got here. This has been very enhanced. And this really comes directly from the idea of transparency, which is the big complaint in the marketplace has been, when I look in organizations' audited financials and I look at an organization's Form 990, the numbers are all different. And I can't figure out which is the one that's really presenting what's going on in the organization. How come they've got all these different numbers? What's the truth? And so what this is the IRS's attempt to say, look, there's different laws that are governing them. One's being governed by accounting rules, the other's being governed by tax rules. But here are the reconciling items. Here's why there are the discrepancies. That's what this thing is designed. So that if I'm using both of those two documents and I'm not an accountant, I have some level of understanding of what's going on. IRS is still working on this. The AICPA, which is my trade association, American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, we've been working with the IRS a lot on this redesign. We've provided a lot of comments back, and this is one of the areas that we're most concerned about. We've been working with the IRS to see if maybe there's a clearer way to kind of present this, because this is still a little bit murky. But I wanted you to realize it was out here. I'm not going to take us through the rest of the form because there really are a lot of other things that are in the form. But I think you're getting the general idea about governance. I do want to again just highlight, if we go back to, and you don't need to do it, but if we go all the way back to those key concepts of Sarbanes-Oxley. And when we spend all that time talking about the different elements, the establishment and role of the audit committee, conflict of interest policies, code of ethics, document destruction and retention policies, financial oversight, whistleblower provision, compliance with regulators and regulations, independent board members, internal controls, you can start to see that even though those came straight out of obviously Sarbanes-Oxley, a clear, absolute clear cascade, at least on the governance side of things, right into the Form 990. With that, I'm going to just open it up for some questions. Perhaps anybody has questions? Yeah, I will. Thank you. So give me your fiscal year end and then I'll answer it. June 30? Okay, so for an organization that is a June 30, they are going to use that 2008 form for their fiscal year ending June 30/09. Okay? Everybody gets that with the fiscal years? Okay. Okay, I think that's a great question. I've certainly heard this a lot, and the question really is, well, wait a minute. Suppose you're dealing with small organizations, or you're an organization that has a finance committee that has assumed the role of the audit committee. Or by the way, even one more step, which is you have a board. You have a board of 3 people, and it's assumed the role of the audit committee. How would you answer the question, or do you think that that's appropriate? Should we be doing something different? And again, I would say, that's where you're back to that's where you're back to the Schedule O, which is really just explaining what exactly it is that you do. The danger, again, this is my take on it. The danger of these yes and no questions is that I think people think that if you answer yes, that's the right answer, and if you answer no, that's the wrong answer. And the reality is, for your own organization, that's not necessarily true. For your own organization, no might be the appropriate answer, and you just need to, either accept that you're going to just put no and leave it at that, or you're going to put no and you're going to talk about why it's no. You're an organization that's a little tiny startup organization, and you have 3 board members, and they happen to be related as how it starts. You might not have independent board members in the beginning. So, and that might be appropriate for your organization. Maybe that's not appropriate as you get bigger and bigger. So I think organizations are going to have to really, really sit down with their accountants or their legal counsel and their board and their management and say, of these policies, which are the ones that we think might need revision in our organization versus which are the ones we're very comfortable with, and what we need to do is come up with, a description of what it is we do to tell the marketplace, and not necessarily changing what we do. I think there'll be some combination of both of those things. Other comments, questions? Okay, that's a really great question. The question is, hey, wait a minute, so there are some organizations that are really small. The move to trying to get all of this implemented might be a hugely prohibitive, either in cost or in time. And then the follow-up part to that is there any kind of move to move this on to the 1023, which is or 1024, which is the application for exemption? And the particularly excellent point about that is that the IRS, in all of its public relations discussions about this form, makes the point that a lot of these questions are already asked on the 1023. In fact, the 1023 was redesigned a couple of years ago, a bunch of years, maybe 2-3 years ago, and it's been out there with a lot of these kind of governance questions. And that's where the IRS has kind of held firm in saying, well, we're already asking a lot of this on the 1023, so we're going to ask it again on the Form 990. Organizations should be used to it. Great question. Anything else? The question is, first of all, no, I'm not the right person, but I will answer the question. The question is, will the BBB, with its standards, will they be expanding the standards to encompass any of this? And, what I would tell you is, if you look at BBB standards, if you look at independent sector, which produced principles on governance, self-regulation, if you look at the IRS itself on its life cycle, on the charities homepage, if you go to the life cycle, they've got a governance draft. A lot of these things are out there already as being tenets of good governance. The question is, under what authority did the IRS ask these questions, decide to ask these questions? And if anybody knows Steve Miller is the commissioner of TEGE, tax-exempt government entities. And when Steve Miller was asked that fairly similar question, and maybe slightly different words, his answer was, if the IRS doesn't do it, who will do it? So here we are doing it. That's the answer. That's the answer. Again, realizing however you choose to answer these questions, they're not tax code driven, but enhancing compliance, because we go all the way back to that same theme, which is the IRS believes a good governed organization is a more compliant with the tax code organization. Well, actually, I'm not so sure they ever really thought they weren't in the governance business. I think that there was a really big issue about how far into the governance business they were going to go. And there's an IRS committee, it's an advisory committee that actually had a couple of forums and discussions about, should the IRS be in governance or shouldn't it be in governance, or, what should the role be or not be, or so on and so forth. Doesn't really matter. Here they are. I thank you very much. I thank you very much for your time. Our time is up. If anybody has any questions, you can come talk to me afterward.